Good morning, everyone. All right, time to be quiet. All right, good morning. Welcome to day 2 of our National Ataxia Conference. Glad to see everybody here bright and cheery in the morning. I've got a couple housekeeping items to take care of first. Please turn off your cell phones. Respect everybody around you by not answering the phone. Visit the exhibitor area and silent auction. The silent auction will close, I think, at 2 o'clock, and the drawings will be 3 to 7 to pick things up. Drink plenty of water. Make sure you stay hydrated during the conference. At the registration table, there's extra bags, so take some because we can't use them again. And be sure at the registration table, if you haven't done it already, pick up your banquet tickets for this evening. And I wanted to start out with David Lebron always had his top 10. So I thought I'd start out with the AAC top 10, what I feel is number 10, slur speech is normal. Number 9, you get to see old friends. Many of us have been here for years. We get to see people we haven't seen for a while. 8, you get to meet new friends. 7, you find out shoulder shrug ataxia. If you don't know what that is, his doctor looks at it and goes, I don't know. And SCA 24/7 are real. And 24/7 is from Jason Wolfer from Oregon, and that was a new one to me last year. You get to interact with ataxia researchers and specialists. As Harry Orr said yesterday, you get to humanize the researchers humanize us because they don't always get to see us as ataxians. And we get to see them on a casual basis instead of the sterile clinical environment we're used to seeing them in. Number 5, you get to dance at the banquet and everyone else looks just as goofy. Number 4, you can stumble down the hall without people wondering how much you had to drink. Number 3, you learn cool new vocabulary words like Ataxia. And if you know what that is when you're walking in the evening and lights seem to be going in circles. You don't know what the word is the next time you tell a doctor you got that problem. Number 2, because of the work of the ataxia researchers and the National Ataxia Foundation, there's hope for the future. And number 1, you look around and you see you're not alone. And that's probably the biggest thing, is you know there's community out there and they're here to support you. And with that, I'm going to announce the first speaker, Dr. David Lynch. He's at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, affectionately known in the region as CHOP. And he specializes in Friedreich's ataxia and other childhood diseases. Please welcome Dr. David Lynch.
So thank you very much for inviting me to speak here, as I've done several times in the past. Today's talk is a little different, but I'll refine it back to my usual topic because that's the way I tend to be. It's a very diverse group here, as I think you all know, with some things in common, but many things that are different. So being asked to speak about childhood ataxias and recessive ataxias, and trying to find a talk which unites some of the things that they have in common as well as amplifies a few differences can be a little difficult. I'll also mention right now that if people have individual questions that they want to ask me, I'll be around for a little bit after the talk, and then I'm back all afternoon for the Birds of a Feather session, so you can just find me then. So I'm talking about Friedreich ataxia and other childhood ataxias. I have to show the usual disclaimer, which is required that be careful about anything that you see here should be talked about with your individual physician to be sure that it's actually perfectly correct for you. The other disclosures is that I do have a lot of funding sources, including grants from those 6 pharmaceutical foundations and or 5 pharmaceutical companies, as well as the Friedreich Ataxia Research Alliance at the end. So pediatric ataxia. Ataxia, when most people think about it as an adulthood phenomenon, is also relatively common in children as well. In children, in contrast to adults, it usually constitutes a recessive disease, if it is genetic, in which each parent is a carrier and has no symptomatology. Dominant ataxias do present in childhood, usually with a very severe phenotype, particularly those that carry so-called CAG repeat disorders in which there's a substantial amount of anticipation. But if you go into a pediatric neurology department, most of the ataxia you see that is of a genetic nature is recessive. The most common of these is Friedreich ataxia, which I think everyone knows I see more frequently than anything else. We at CHOP follow about 350 people with FA. It is an ataxia including both sensory aspects in which people cannot localize where their bodies are in space, as well as primary issues in the cerebellum itself with difficulty of coordination. The other aspects of Friedreich ataxia which are important and actually are the life-threatening aspects of it are heart disease, where people have an unusual type of heart disease where their hearts become thick, leading to difficulty of handling large fluid loads, and then eventually in some individuals that thick muscle changes to fibrous tissue and becomes unable to pump. So that issues arise with life expectancy in 20s and 30s in some, but not all individuals. The other big issue outside the nervous system in Friedreich ataxia is scoliosis. About 70% of people with Friedreich ataxia have scoliosis, and about 40% will actually undergo surgical correction of this, usually in your teenage years. So that's the time when scoliosis becomes most problematic and orthopedic surgery may be necessary. In addition, about 20% of people with FA get diabetes. It can be both early onset or it can be much later onset. So it's really both a type 1 and type 2-like phenomenon. FA is the most common disease we see. Slightly less common is a disorder known as ataxia telangiectasia, which is another one that most neurologists and pediatric neurologists should know about. It's a little bit different in that most of the difficulty arises not from the loss of the sensory neurons early, but difficulty with the cerebellum itself, the area concerned with balance, getting substantially smaller. You also get other nervous system issues, including movement disorders. And by movement disorder, what a neurologist means is difficulty moving without true weakness, so developing unusual postures, tremor, rigidity. These things can come on quite early in ataxia telangiectasia. The other key issue in ataxia telangiectasia is all those things that occur outside the nervous system, which I would actually argue are more problematic than most of those in FA. That includes pulmonary difficulties, as well as sensitivity to radiation and sensitivity to oncologic, neoplastic, cancer-causing processes, so that the entire management of people with ataxia telangiectasia has to include limitation of exposure to things which can potentially cause cancer because people are much more sensitive. That's one of the biggest long-term issues. In addition, cognitive issues are relatively prominent in people with AT. After Friedreich ataxia and ataxia telangiectasia, which I always call AT, if you go to your local pediatric neurologist, you will usually see a reaction from them because they have not realized that they have actually met people with these other disorders because they're all described in the time since these individuals went through residency. There are large numbers of it, and it is impossible to cover them all in a 2-hour talk. So I'm not going to try and cover them all or even mention them all, but try and mention a couple of them as well as the things they may have in common. There are two which are probably closely related to ataxia telangiectasia, not only at the clinical level in that they have mainly issues with the cerebellum itself, but also at the scientific level in that there's evidence for difficulties in repairing DNA. These are called ataxia with oculomotor apraxia, type 1, and ataxia with oculomotor apraxia, type 2. It's brilliant. You know they sent us to school to learn how to name things like that? Probably some federal tax dollars went into that. So think about that when you think about your next donation. So these are characterized, many people have difficulty moving their eyes, but not everyone does. So the names in some way are misnomers. It just describes how we first found them. Another syndrome, which can occur in children more than in adults, is a group of disorders called ataxia with coenzyme Q deficiency. What is this? Children, sometimes adults, who present with slowly progressive ataxia, whose feature is that if you look at some place in their body, blood, muscle, sometimes other tissues, they don't make enough of the vitamin called coenzyme Q, the stuff you can buy at the grocery store. That's important because that coenzyme Q deficiency is important in at least some cause of the pathophysiology, and some individuals with this disorder will recover to normal with administration of coenzyme Q. This is not common, but because of that response, it's important that a person know that they don't have one of these syndromes. There's an easy way to figure it out. Have your doctor get you some coenzyme Q, or go to the grocery store on your own and take it a little bit. It is that responsive in its most responsive elements. And then one more, which is a very specific disorder called ataxia with vitamin E deficiency, a disorder where you look almost identical to Friedreich ataxia, but it comes not from the gene from Friedreich ataxia, but from a different gene which keeps you from absorbing vitamin E, or really absorbing vitamin E very well. It is, again, early on, 100% treatable with large quantities of vitamin E, about 10 times what is commonly given to individuals for other purposes. So that is an entirely treatable one. So those two disorders of ataxia with coenzyme Q deficiency and ataxia with vitamin E deficiency, every child who has ataxia, you should be sure that they do not have them. That's the single most important thing I say, even as I'm going to talk about a lot of other stuff, because those are entirely treatable on, April 6, 2018. Got to check up on the date. So there are numerous other ones that have been identified genetically. Some of them can be identified commercially, some of them can't. We can't go through them all, but what do they have in common? Well, in all of these, including Friedreich ataxia and ataxia telangiectasia, the key element to maintaining one's abilities and even improving, stabilizing long-term is being active. The more you do, the more you do. Another brilliant statement we learned in medical school. The way to keep that doing is rehabilitation and physical therapy. You will find people, and you know this better than most doctors do, how important it is to simply stay moving, because the more you train yourself to move and stay on balance, the better you stay on balance. If you're being denied physical therapy, please ask your doctor to fight with your insurance company. The other aspects is that we talk about these as ataxia, but most of the pediatric ataxias are not pure. They have other features involved, which sometimes can be responsive to therapeutic medications. AOA1 and Friedreich ataxia both have a large component of neuropathic pain that is readily treatable by the generic gabapentin or other related agents. Relatively well tolerated except for occasional sleepiness, but they can be very, very important in managing the disorder. In addition, in most of these disorders, while we talk about their balance difficulty, there is an underlying loss of the neurons which control strength and motor tone, so-called corticospinal tract or upper motor neurons. When people lose those, the spasms they get and the stiffness can be responsive to muscle relaxants such as baclofen, which is not habit-forming and is a relatively safe medicine. The other thing is, as you go to talk about pediatric ataxias and look at clinical care, be sure that the non-neurological manifestations are being managed. It might require a neurologist to step outside of their comfort zone. Wouldn't I do that? Or maybe it requires being sure that your family physicians and primary care physicians are well integrated in the care. So the person with AT is having their pulmonary manifestations taken care of. The person with FA is having their cardiac manifestations taken care of. These are things whose importance cannot be overstated. After that, the different pediatric ataxias start diverging. And they all share a genetic basis, and the individual therapies that come from research, you must realize if they are directed to that genetic basis, they will be relatively selective for the disease in question. That is, therapies designed specifically to control Friedreich ataxia will have limited, if any, applicability to ataxia telangiectasia and vice versa. The selectivity allows, to a certain extent, the safety, but also allows the frustration that progress in one disorder does not always mean progress in another. How do we try and move forward? Well, the way we do this, as you heard Harry talk about yesterday and was introduced before, is systematic research. And that is the way we find new things. So I will mention a little bit more detail about Friedreich ataxia, because it is Dave Lynch actually talking here. Remember the Friedreich ataxia is about 1 in every 50,000 people, a number that you don't really need to know, but I have to have memorized. So they're about, when you mentioned that people are not alone, many people with FA don't realize there are about 4,000 to 5,000 people in the United States, which doesn't sound like a lot until you go to collaborative groups that can put 40 or 50 of these people in a room together, just as this conference today puts 40 or 50 people of different ataxias together. It is FA, like AT and other ones, it's thought about as a neurologic disease, but in fact involves multiple systems. Not everyone with FA is the same. For example, if you, the people who have the worst genetic abnormalities have, see if I get, oops, wrong thing. Go forward one. With the worst genetic abnormalities present in childhood, and they have the most difficult course. Usually the onset is between 5 and 15, but it can be later in the teens, and even the latest person I see with presentation was age 65. So it can really drag out through life and when people show up. The later onset individuals do have slower progression, and I will say they never get heart disease, so their life expectancy is unaffected. If you go through the individual items in FA, what you might have talked about, ataxia, difficulty with balance, difficulty with speech, which is a particular mixture of upper motor neuron and cerebellar speech, loss of reflexes, loss of sensation, and I'll note the loss of reflexes occurs before you ever go to see a neurologist. And to a certain extent, muscle weakness, really not because the muscle degenerates, but because the muscle isn't functioning well. Cognition is relatively spared, although more recently we're identifying things as you get larger cohorts and more systematically examine them. There's a very selective loss of cells. It is largely in the sensory pathways very early, probably, in my opinion, before we meet people, but if Massimo Pandolfo was here, he would be disagreeing with me. Fortunately, Massimo's not here today. Later parts of the cerebellum itself actually change. Most people have heart disease as well as curvature of the spine. About up to one-third of people have diabetes or some component of it. I like to call it type 1.5. What do I mean? Early disease is type 1 diabetes, insulin dependent from the beginning, and you don't make enough insulin. Late diabetes, the sort that those individuals who are 58 and who have a family history and might have too much cholesterol and have high blood pressure, and I wouldn't know anyone like that, tend to get type 2 diabetes, which is not usually insulin requiring early, but can be managed by diet and exercise. People with FA are halfway in the middle. That is, they don't make enough insulin, but they also are not sensitive to insulin, so that they will get it either early or they can get it late sometime, like other people in the room who might be at the front of this room right now. So it's really type 1.5, depending on who they are. In addition, they get muscle issues which are there and really affect their ability to stand and walk, but we don't see them on exam because they're not severe enough, but I do believe they affect people's lives, are important. One thing I will mention is a difficulty in vision in FA. The textbooks say that about 5% of people with FA get vision loss. Well, one thing we have done over the past 2 decades as we have followed people longer and longer is we see more and more people with vision loss. I think it's not because it's increasing in true frequency, it's because we're following people and looking more. This becomes a major issue long term, which we're actually in discussions with several companies about specific therapy for the vision loss of FA. It says 5% in the textbooks. I would rate it closer to 50% of the early onset individuals. And this is not unimportant because it does reach levels of 2,200, which is quite problematic. People with FA can present as early as age 2, as late as age 75 in the literature. Most people are using wheelchairs by their late 20s, if not earlier. It's about 16 years after diagnosis. People die from only one thing if they die early, and that's heart disease. One thing we discovered when we started looking at a large group of individuals is that people with FA are systematically small. This is a curve where what we've done is look at the body mass index percentiles across a large group of FA and compared them to the population. And the left-hand side is people who are really, really thin. Not necessarily enough to be worked up by their pediatrician, but right at that border. And about 20 or 30% of the people with FA fall in the first 10 percentile rank. So people are really, really thin with FA. This is a part of the disease. If you do fall below the 5th percentile, your pediatrician will want to look at things. They don't have to look farther than Friedreich ataxia as a cause. How do we know it's part of the disease? Because we can induce it in mice when we knock out the frataxin gene. What is the genetic basis of Friedreich ataxia? As many of you know, it's from a triplet repeat, which interferes with production of the protein we call frataxin, another brilliantly named event. The GAA actually gets the length of it determines the relative phenotype. And some people, about 4%, have one abnormal GA repeat as well as a single base change in the other gene they have. And remember, you have to have 2 abnormal genes to get FA. That single base change knocks out the protein, usually keeps it from the frataxin protein from being made. You can look at that GA repeat, and we look at the shorter one. And this graph here correlates on the y-axis, the age at onset, the time we meet people with FA, with the number of GA repeats in the smaller allele. As you look at this graph, you can see it looks like a line. So the longer GA repeats, the earlier it gets to be. Now, since my daughter has a test on hyperbolas today in her math class, I would think everyone would recognize that it's really a hyperbola. And so that's actually part of the mathematical construct. So those of you who have teenage kids who are going through pre-calculus right now, you should realize that it will be used later in life. We know that we've done pretty good research on FA because this curve is from Alessandra Durer. I don't know if she's still here, but she was here earlier in the week. This is from 1997. We could generate exactly the same curve now, which means we sort of get Friedreich ataxia. And what Friedreich ataxia represents, and this is from Sanjay Bidichandani, as you look at the Western blots here, is simply you don't make enough of the protein we call frataxin. No more, no less. And those individuals who have not 2 GA repeat lengths, but 1 GA repeat length abnormality and a point mutation so they don't make any protein at all off of that, they look exactly the same as people with typical FA. What that tells us is really it's the protein and nothing else which is the issue. Carriers have 50% of normal levels, and they are entirely normal human beings from a medical perspective. So I'll let people who have FA talk about their parents who are obligate carriers any way they choose. So this is simply frataxin deficiency. Compared to the other ataxias, this is a relatively simple disease biochemically. What does frataxin do? It helps you make energy. This is a diagram that Rob Wilson borrowed from a biochemistry book a long time ago. Frataxin allows you to put iron in the enzymes which make energy in your body. As a result, FA is simply an energy disease of selected cells. So it's relatively a simple disease. You know, these GA repeat links turn the gene off so you don't make enough frataxin. That leads to difficulties making energy in your mitochondria, and specifically the enzymes that use iron and sulfur. That happens in certain cells, and that leads to disease. So we've got 4 steps, and this is what we said in 1997, and thus this should be a really easy thing to treat/cure, correct? Well, it's not quite so simple. One, because you can always learn more about the pathophysiology. But the other thing is studying rare disease, which is essentially what this room is about, is not so easy. When you look at the typical diabetes study or the typical hypertension study, it will be a study of 1,000 people. Even Parkinson's disease, you will have high hundreds numbers of individuals. That would be the entire population of many of the diseases which we all talk about. So there are not that many people to participate. They're spread across the United States. And even there, not everyone looks identical. And from a viewpoint, if people aren't identical, how do you mix or match them together? And that's actually a substantial portion of what clinical research is. So how fast have things moved in FA in terms not of success, but in terms of trial? We found the original GA repeat link mutation in 1996. We sort of knew it was in mitochondrial in 1997. So if we look back at the FARA pipeline and all the drugs in development from several years ago, you can produce this slide. This is a 2016 slide which Jennifer Farmer's given me, and there we are. And what you see as each one of those different lines going from the left to the right is a different drug or different class of drugs at different stages of development. All the way to the right means it's sold at your drugstore. So many of them have gotten a large way there, but none of them have gotten all the way there. This emphasizes one thing, is that things can move fast when people work together, but also that you have to do a lot of things and get things all the way across from the left side, which is testing in cells, then to testing in animals, then to safety in humans, then to chip shots in humans if thinks it's the Masters weekend, and then finally to actually putting it in the hole or winning the Masters. We'll compare it to that. That takes a lot of steps, and only by systematically going through and everyone working together can you get there. So the simple things you need are these. And you might recognize the guy who's smiling in such a very weird way right now. He's around the audience, I'm told. As well as another one of my patients who's a substantial amount younger than Kyle. You have to find a way to measure the disease. And measuring the disease as we do research-wise is not the same as simply going to your doctor. Measuring what I do in the office when I see someone with ataxia is my goal is to take care of them. That's not the same as necessarily doing a research test. And do not take research results as dogma for clinical care. A lot of people want to know the detailed research results. It's more important whether you feel better and whether you do better in your life than what my numbers say. The next thing is we have to have blood tests and other simple ways to triage mechanisms, drugs as they come forward. That's where a lot of work is right now. We also have to know what the destiny of people is as they move forward, what the natural history data is. That allows us to tell us what the roadmap should be, and if we know the detailed roadmap, we'll know a lot better whether we've done better than expected or worse than expected in a shorter period of time. That's why if you're in FA, you participate in one of the various natural history studies, and if you're in autosomal dominant or other ataxias, you work with the NAF to participate in one of their natural history studies. I would note the next thing is you need funding. One of the most effective things I would mention is the natural history studies, places where people can go to participate in simple research protocols which are largely observation. How have things changed? How have blood tests changed? This is incredibly important. Every one of those drug companies who you saw in the FARA pipeline is with us because of the natural history background. This is easier for FA because people are more alike, and it is harder for autosomal dominant and other ataxias, both based on scarcity and based on the complicated phenotype. But these natural history studies are appearing, particularly as funded through NAF and the autosomal dominant ataxias and their rare disease and their UO1 grant from the government to move forward. If you have the opportunity, I encourage you to go to these sites. Not every place does them. There are 10 sites for FA in the country. I forget the exact number for autosomal dominant since I'm not directly involved. But if you can, please go. They usually have money to cover your travel. The other thing to keep in mind is as you see them, it may not officially be clinical care. I don't know any researcher who will decline the correct answer to a question if you ask it to them. So you'll get free medical advice if you're looking for it. This map here shows we have a collaborative group in Europe and in the United States in FA. The stars are where people are. Different places follow a different number of individuals, and it's not that hard to get to them, and I strongly encourage it. The other thing I want to go back to the pipeline is as I look at this color-coded guide here, each color is a different type of molecule, a different approach to treating disease. Simple story, since we're just after Easter, don't put all your eggs in one basket because you never know what the future holds in terms of risk. There may be new side effects that none of us have imagined which appear, and if you put all your eggs in one basket, this pipeline would stop. This is one of the things which have been done well in FA, even if none has gotten to the finish line. The other thing is for research studies, we have to find a way to meet you all. So I can come out here and talk, and I don't want to call this an advertisement, but there's another way. I believe NAF, and I know FARA run what we call registries. You go in there, you deposit, in the case of the FARA registry, a minimal amount of information, your name, your email address, and your age. Then when any study appears, be it a clinical trial or something else that you could participate in, you get an email and say, call the site if you really want to do it. It allows studies to recruit very fast, and in rare diseases, that is the biggest issue. If you can't find the people, you don't get there. FARA has a registry. NAF also has a registry for dominant ataxias. And I say my time's running out, so I'll speak faster. I didn't think that was possible. The other thing to realize is when you go, blood samples cheek swab samples, skin biopsy samples are very important. This says what we hold in our freezer across town. We hold DNA. What that's about to be used for is a large gene modifier study where someone's going to look for other genes across 1,000 people that are involved in FA and new targets. Each drug company that we work with wants to see blood tests that they could design for their drug. They can know that if we send them samples derived from patients originally, and then they can study them. We do the same thing with cheek swabs. This is used to pilot the data which they will use in clinical trials. In FA, there are 3 open clinical trials. The most important to say, there's 2 which are running in multiple adult centers, the RT408 and TK831, as well as the epicatechin, which is enrolling children at Mayo. So people will ask me, well, how's this, is that the drug which will work? And I will say the most important thing, the study is going well. I am well blinded. I have no idea whether people are getting better or not. And that's the way you do a fair experiment, and that's what the goal is. So remember, the goal through studies is that we all get to the finish line by getting the right answer. And I think I'm going to skip that one since I've shown it multiple times. If anyone wants to know all the drugs, I'll talk about them at the birds of feather later. In addition, the things for conclusions, pediatric ataxias are usually recessive. Remember physical therapy and general care. Do not forget coenzyme Q deficiency and vitamin E deficiency. And further research is the way to moving forward across anything. If you want to find me, that's my name, that's my email address. I don't go anywhere except to my office and like here and home. That's about it. I don't travel. So if you have questions, email me anytime. Thank you for your attention. I tried to speak slow.
Afterwards.
Okay, fine.
Yep. All right. I forgot to do something before I started. I forgot to mention myself. I'm Mike Kammerer. I'm the support group leader for the Central Pennsylvania area. So if you do have ataxia or you're a caregiver and you would like more information about our support group, please see me later. I'll be around all evening, and I'll hook you up with some information and my email address and everything to get started. Our next speaker is known real well in the ataxia community. And I have ataxia myself, so if you hear a little bit of slurring and poor speech, it's because of that. But our next speaker is Dr. Jeremy Schwamman. He is a professor at Harvard Medical School and a neurologist at Mass General Hospital. He's the founding director of the Ataxia unit there and also the director of the neuroanatomy and cerebellar microneurology at Mass General. I'm sorry. Please welcome Dr. Jeremy Schwamman.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with you. What a great group. This is one of the highlights of my year, to be part of the National Ataxia Foundation meeting, both the annual members meeting and the Ataxia investigators meeting. I feel like I'm at home among family and friends with the Ataxia community. You are my extended family, and we care about you and do what we can to try and get us all to a better place. My charge this morning is to talk about genetic testing. You should get tested, and here's why. Should is never a great word. You know, you should do this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a conversation with you. So this is a new one for me for a while. I haven't talked without slides for a long time. No slides. So it's just me. And what I want to do is have a conversation. Camille has a microphone which she'll take around later on, and I'm happy to take questions from the group this morning. But I want to tell you some of the things that go through my mind, because what this is essentially is a conversation that I have on a regular basis with people who come and see me in the office. So the whole issue of genetic testing, what's up with that? I'm going to set the stage into a dichotomy of relationships that we have with you, I and the folks on this side of the desk, so to speak, and you, and I see it in two distinct ways. The first is the doctor-patient relationship. And in this setting, our job, what we take seriously, what we learn, what we take into our core, is to bring the compassionate, caring, and kindness that we can muster to you to try and make life better, to get you to a better place, to become familiar with what's going on, to empower you to feel that your life is moving in a direction that at least you have some control over, and to try and make life as good as it can be given what landed in your lap. That's the doctor-patient relationship on the one hand. And in that sense, we're all patients. All of us go see doctors for one reason or another. So we're all patients, and in that environment, we're the doctors and you're the patients, and we'll do whatever we can to help out. But there's another part of this equation which is important and becoming increasingly important. And it's the recognition that you're not patients, you're not research subjects, you are experts. You are experts by experience. It's a very nice term I learned from the people who are doing patient-reported outcome measures, and I'll come back to that later. But you're experts by experience, and you are our collaborators. So I'm going to ask you to keep both of those hats on in mind, as I take you through what I'd like to share with you in terms of the importance of genetic testing. The one is the patient-doctor relationship, and the other is you as the investigators, the collaborators on the research team. We all play a role in the team, both in the clinic and in the research environment. So that's how I want to share this with you. So I came up with a concept called the need to know imperative, and it's stood me well for years. The need to know imperative is what I learned from patients, from people who come to see us in the clinic. And it's the sense of frustration and anger and isolation and loneliness at not knowing what it is that I have. This is human curiosity. What is going on with me? What is this thing? Someone said I have a cerebellum ataxia, is the term that people generally come to us with. The doctor said I have ataxia and I have a small cerebellum, and that's what I have. But is that really all I have? So the issue here is, how do you get into the driver's seat? How do you take charge of your own life? How do you get empowered with what we call agency, your ability to drive your own show? How do you know what to type into Google to figure out what it is that I have? What are the consequences of my illness? What is part of the disease? What is not? Is the tingling and numbness in my feet a part of my disease? Is heart disease part of my disease? Is scoliosis part of my disease? Is the trouble with sleep, thrashing in my sleep, or difficulty with jumpy legs, is that part of my disease? So all the features that go into this, from cognition to neuromuscular, you can get a handle on by knowing what it is, in fact, that you're dealing with. There's a sense of belonging, a sense of agency. The journey is now different. So when you get the gene diagnosis, it's really as a turning point in life, and many of you have gone through this. There's life before the conversation and life after the conversation. I now know what this gene is. This is in my life, and now I know where to go with this. You also have the opportunity to seek prevention. If you know that this is a disease that's going to be progressive over time and may, for example, cause falling, you would want to make sure that your bones are in good shape. So this is where your discussions with your primary care doctor and the endocrinologist becomes particularly important. If I'm going to fall, how do I not break my bone? Are there other aspects of the disease that I can know about that aren't just my being down or upset or unhappy about not knowing, but actually part of the illness? Knowing, for example, in the cognitive sphere, which I spend time with, that mood or depression changes or multitasking issues may be part of the disease. That knowledge empowers you. So in that sense, I went to a school where the school motto was knowledge is light. Knowledge is light, knowledge is power. It empowers you to have a sense of your own story. So it ends the journey of diagnostic exploration, because now we know what this is. The folks who don't have a gene diagnosis I can come back to later on, but in terms of having the gene, that's the power for you, the symptomatic person, of the genetic diagnosis. It puts you in the driver's seat. Now I know what birds of a feather group I go to. It's as simple as that. And who the people are that I can talk with and get some sense of how I can learn from my own colleagues and my own friends and other people like this who are going through this along with me. The second is because the gene isn't just about an issue of what's happening to you, but about what's happening to your family, it becomes a very important piece of information for the family. And there are many ramifications of this. One of which includes you become the caregiver for your family. Because if you know something about your own disease, the conversation I've had with patients goes like this. What if your children come to you later and say, you mean you knew and you didn't tell me? So that's not a conversation you want to get involved in, because there's a downside to that I don't have to belabor. But there are implications for brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts, children, families across town, families across the world. This is a powerful piece of information that is not something at this point in life to be hidden or run away from or to hide under the carpet or to be ashamed of, frankly. There's no stigma in this now. These are neurological disorders that happen because of the way that genetics works. And so the power of the information in terms of family is huge. We have the ability now to prevent the diseases from continuing. We now have, for example, pre-implantation genetics. So if somebody has a dominant disease, you have a dominant disease, SCA 1, 2, 3, 6, one of those diseases, and you already have children, your kids are 1 in 2 chance of getting the disease at some point down the road. Bear in mind that having a gene and having a disease is not the same thing. I'll come back to insurance conversations later. But if you have the gene, the likelihood is that at some point in life, the ataxia will manifest. And so the question then is for your children who will themselves have families, they can stop this from passing on. We're in an era of true science fiction. The science fiction of pre-implantation genetics, where you can have the fertilization outside of the womb, what was test tube babies, which is done routinely in the in vitro fertilization clinics, and you can then test the embryos for the gene or not, and you put the gene the embryo that doesn't have the gene back into the mom, so you can stop it cold. And prevention an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, isn't that the story? So you can stop the disease cold with pre-implantation genetics. You don't have to get involved in all the ethical conversations about termination of pregnancy or getting an amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling, all of which have some risks. The pre-implantation genetics, I believe, is now covered by insurance. It's not cheap, but it's covered, I believe, at least in part. And that's a way to stop this from going on. So that's directly relevant to your kids. And the story that I hear from patients all the time is, I have this, okay, I get that, but I'm worried about my kids. So that's the power of the gene information for your own children. And they can then have the genetic testing at some point when it's relevant to them in childbearing age. If your kids are young, we generally don't test kids under the age of 18, but I suspect that when we get the gene treatments that are directly targeted at that particular gene, that conversation may change. When exactly we start those treatments, we don't yet know, but at least the option is there. For those who have a recessive gene disorder, in other words, both parents have to carry the gene for the child or the patient to have the risk of having disease, now you have very powerful information too, because the child of a recessive ataxia person is by definition a carrier. If you have a recessive disease, your child by definition is a carrier. But then the question is the child's spouse a carrier? So you can get the gene test because you're going to be a carrier and never have the disease. This is the child. And when your child gets married and wants to have their own family, you can then test the spouse to see, does a spouse have that one particular gene, a couple $100 for a gene test, not that expensive, and now you know the answer. And if they're one of those 1 in 50,000 or whatever who carries the gene, then you have to be careful you'll do the pre-implantation genetics. But if not, you're off the hook. So you can end these diseases. X-linked recessive disorders are similarly arranged. These are diseases that are on the male chromosome, when they manifest in men, passed down through moms. It's a bit more tricky, but there's a way to do that in terms of genetic testing. The pre-symptomatic testing in terms of prevention is another question. So here, it's a conversation that happens a lot. Dad has SCA3, I don't want to get tested, don't want to know. Well, that has two implications. And this is where the conversation, this is where the rubber meets the road in the conversation. In the pre-symptomatic person, there's a few ways to go. I'll come back to the research testing in a minute. But for the clinical care, for your own life, your own decision-making in life, it is your choice to have gene testing or not. But here's where the responsibility comes down. Let me go back to that comment. You mean you knew and you didn't tell me? Now it's the grandchildren growing up asking the question. And in a sense, it's their life and they do have a right to know. So from that perspective, I think it's worth thinking about the long-term consequences of such a decision. In a sense, it's not, it's that cynical phrase, it's not about you. It is about you, but in a sense, in terms of your family, it's about them. So here's where the question comes in. Do you get tested in order to make sure you don't pass the disease on? The other part of this is, where I would suggest that knowing is better than not knowing, is you can start to plan your life. So there may be life choices. We all have life choices. Do I do this career or that career? I have these various interests. Where do I put my talent and my time? If you know that you're likely to have a problem with your balance and gait, becoming a professional athlete may not be the best choice for you, but doing something else could. And then you have the option later on in life also to make sure you have preventive measures. This gets into things that we're bad at in medicine and we should be better at it. Knowing what the exercises are, knowing what the dietary habits should be, knowing about life choices in terms of healthy lifestyle living. There's much that we can do that we haven't yet got a handle on, but hopefully will in the next few years, to make sure that you're in the best possible shape you can be in to handle the challenges down the road. And this isn't just an old wives' tale. Not that there's anything wrong with being an old wife, but nevertheless. The deal is this, that there are ways to live life that affect your genetics. The nature-nurture interaction is real. We know, for example, that about 50% or 60% of the information about when your disease will onset and how fast it will progress is contained in the gene information, which means there's a good 30, 40+% of the predictive power of your own particular disorder that is not in the gene. We don't know where it is. Maybe it's another gene. Maybe it's in how much exercise you get. Maybe it's in what you eat. Maybe it's in how you feel about yourself. We don't know the answers to that, but that lack of knowledge is a good thing for us because it gives us opportunity to move to a better place. I'm going to go to the third part. So there's three messages for today. One is you as the patient, you as the patient educator of your family, because now you have the gene. And the third is you as the expert by experience, the research collaborator. In a sense, you could think about it as this way, that we get onto the team by virtue of education, background, and experience and training, but you have to have a ticket to get on the team. Your ticket to get on the team is the gene testing. The reality is whether they're looking for genes that can be fixed and therefore stop the disease from coming on, the antisense oligonucleotide or RNA interference or CRISPR technology, all the things that are coming down the road on the one hand, or what Biohaven is doing and Cadent and the other drug companies coming into the mix, trying to find symptomatic therapies. They're not saying all comers with ataxia. They're saying we're going to test SCA 1, 2, 3, whatever. You cannot get into those trials without knowing what the gene is that you have. You can't get into a Friedreich's trial without having the Friedreich's gene. You can't just say, oh, I have ataxia, because we don't know in that setting if you have a mitochondrial ataxia, an X-linked ataxia, or you had some infection many years ago and got left with an ataxia syndrome. So that is a critical piece of your ability to become an expert by experience and collaborator in the research environment. So that's where you've changed hats now from the patient yourself, from the educator of your family, and moving into you as the researcher, as a member of the research team, without whom we can't get this work done. So there are some practical issues here. Some insurance companies can be tough. If you don't know what the rules are in your state and you want to get gene testing, I would suggest you get your life insurance and disability insurance and all the rest of that stuff first. And then you've preempted the conversation about pre-existing disease. This is all regulations. Things change. I can never figure it out myself. But I think if you're concerned about that, get all your ducks in a row and then get your gene testing. There are ways to get gene testing off the record, but whatever it takes in terms of working the system, I think that getting the information is powerful, mostly because, not that we care, but because it matters to you. You care. It helps you drive your life, put your life in perspective. And I think that given that information, given where we are going with the understanding of genetics, of the treatment trials that are coming down the road, your ability to stop the disease in its tracks in your family, your ability to inform your own community that there's a gene disorder, that is empowering. It gives you agency. It puts you in the driver's seat. You're not passive. You know, we live in an environment, in a culture, in a place where we are blessed to be able to take control of things that in the past we could not take control of. So, for example, just if I use a specific example, we up in the Northeast and we see folks who come down from French-Canadian ancestry, and there is a higher incidence, for example, in that population because of a founder effect, people who came from a similar background and all have similar lifestyles and land up having families together. There is a higher incidence of an autosomal recessive cerebellar ataxia type 1, or the Charlevoix-Saguenay ataxia. And so knowing about that, those people in that community or larger members of the family can have themselves tested. They're asymptomatic, but they can make sure that it doesn't pass on. So the power of this information is that it empowers you to make better choices and more optimal choices about you, your own family, and your own community. And before I end off and open up for some questions, and I think we should have some time to chat, one of the issues that Dr. Lynch mentioned, this is a big issue in clinical trials, is the outcome measures. Is how do you measure whether somebody's doing better or worse? And one of the big parts of that is as carefully as we can sculpt our examinations and our MRI scans and everything else, what matters to you, and therefore what the Food and Drug Administration cares about, is what is the meaningfulness of that scale? And this is where we're going to do something different, and it's called a patient-reported outcome measure. So we need you to tell us what it is that matters in your life. They have PROMs for all kinds of disorders. There is no such thing for ataxia. So NAF has actually helped us to get this going, and we're doing it at this meeting. In Salon D, Mary Donovan is my research student, and she is going to give you a website to go to fill out a patient-reported outcome measure. It's the first step. We need about 300 people to reply to that to get to the next step, which then narrows that down. If you don't have time at the meeting, or you can't find Mary, or you're doing something else, you can drop me an email. Just type in my name. I'm completely findable. You can't miss me. There's only one Jeremy Schmarman on the web as far as I know. My email is there, jschmarman, mjh.harvard.edu. So find me if you can't find Mary in Salon D. And I would encourage you to do that because it will help us to help you as the clinical trials go forward, because of the ataxia is absolutely missing, and all the companies want it. They need it because the Food and Drug Administration needs it and wants it. But you cannot get into that study without your ticket, and your ticket is a gene test. So before I finish, for those who don't have a gene, or the gene has not been discovered, but it runs in the family, that's a gene. There are people who do gene discovery, and they're around the country, some very good sites. Most of us can have access to those people. Talk to your doctors, take it one step further. There are gremlins in the gene testing. Some of the common genes, the ones that have the stuttering, cannot be detected by the very powerful second-line testing called exome testing. So if you go straight to exome, you'll miss SCA6. If you just do the first panel of SCA6 and on, you'll miss all the uncommon ones that are occurring. And the places that do the panel, the whole thing, and charge $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, their time is up. There should be hashtag time's up for those guys, because it doesn't cost that anymore. If you get the first panel of the stuttering gene disorders for a few $1,000s, you then go to exome testing, which is now much less expensive than it used to be, and we will, in those testing parameters, find the answers. Also, in some of the studies going on, in particular the CRC SCA study, the natural history study, if people don't have gene testing yet, but it runs in the family and somebody else has it, gene testing is done as part of the natural history study. And then if we find something and you want to have the gene testing, we can then recommend that you be tested in a clear, certified lab to then finalize that. But there's many ways to go about doing this. And my encouragement to you is that this is not something that we are telling you to do, but it's a tool that you now have to empower you to take control of your own lives. And as the science advances together with you, we'll be able to get to the place that we all want to get, which is to end ataxia altogether. I'll take any questions, and thank you for your time. Anybody have any questions or thoughts they want to share with me? Camille has the microphone over there.
Hi, Doctor. Just one quick question. Is Athena the standard place to go for genetic testing?
So I want to be careful here because I have to be careful not to run afoul of anybody. I'll tell you what I do. I stopped using them about 5 years ago. There is a place locally in Boston, and there are other places too, that will do the repeat genes, SCA 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 10, 17, and DERPLA, for a few $1,000s. The other two genes that are stuttering genes are Fragile X tremor-associated ataxia, which is a pretty straightforward clinical diagnosis, actually. So when the doctors see that, people who know what they're doing should be able to diagnose FACS-TAS. The MRI is specific. It occurs in older men usually. There's usually a young child, a male child who had cognitive delays. That's the one. And the other is Friedreich's ataxia, which can be a bit tricky later life because it can look like an SCA, but in early life it's quite diagnostic. So those are the other two repeat disorders that cause ataxia, which have to be paid attention to. Beyond that, we then go straight to exome, because exome will pick up SCA 4, 5, 13, 14, 25, 36, 42. It'll pick up vitamin E deficiency, RSAX, ARCA1, AOA1, AOA2. All the other ones will come out of exome. So from my own perspective, it's become actually incredibly simple. It's a two-stage process, and it should not, at this point, in my own view, be costing anywhere close to what some of the companies are charging. Yes.
Dr. Schmaman, I'm Larry Scott.
Hey, Larry.
And at the international headquarters, quotes, Sue Hagen often gets the question from people around the country, where do I get tested? Who does the testing? And I think that this is really a pertinent issue. And I know you don't know all the places that do, but maybe there are people in this audience who can tell Sue where they got tested. That would help her a great deal.
So I know many of them. I don't want to sort of advertise them from the podium. Your doctors will know where to send. If your doctors don't know where to send, check in with any of the ataxia unit doctors. So if your doctor's out somewhere who doesn't have this experience, get a hold of any of the docs nearby you in an ataxia clinic. You know, when I started the ataxia unit at Mass General in 1994, there were no such things. It's a great sense of pride to me to see that there are now 25 or 30 ataxia units around the country, and people who are flourishing in the field. We have 160 investigators at the meeting the last couple of days. There are ataxia doctors now everywhere. So although everywhere is maybe a bit of an overstatement, but there are many ataxia units. So to answer your question, there are places that do the gene testing. Your ataxia docs should know that. If all else fails, call Sue, who's the font of all wisdom, and she will direct you to the folks who can help get you there. But that should not be an impediment to get the testing. There are places that do it. I can't advertise who they are from the podium.
How about if you tell us what your email address is right now, because we can't find it.
Okay, so it's J. Schmarman. You've got to spell it right. And my wife figured out if you type Jeremy Cerebellum under Google, you'll find me. You can also email Sue. It's J. Schmamann, SCHMAHMANN, at mgh.harvard.edu. Or Jeremy Cerebellum and find the email. Yes.
Hi. My husband has SCA1. We have two daughters in their early 20s. My older daughter, she's 23. Last year she was thinking about getting tested. She actually made an appointment. She lives in Michigan, so she was going to go to the University of Michigan to be tested. I actually talked her out of it because even though I understand the importance of being tested, and I'm sure she will at some point, I didn't feel that she was emotionally in a place where she could handle a positive result. And I guess I haven't really heard that much about what sort of emotional support can be given, especially, a young person starting their life facing this sort of disease. I mean, we obviously try to provide as much as we can as parents, but, along with the testing, I'm a little bit concerned about how that, will play out for her.
Thank you for making sure that I get to that. That's a very important point. What we generally do for adults who have the likelihood of having a gene, a 50% chance of inheritance, is we routinely have them meet with a genetic counselor first. And the genetic counselor goes through with that person what the ins and outs are of having a result either one way or the other. We learned about this from the Huntington experience where people had a catastrophic reaction to hearing the news. This is a little different because SCA1 is a much longer course of disease and one has much more control over it, even though there's many things that go wrong. But I think that that's a helpful approach, is to have her see a professional person, a genetic counselor, a neurologist who can sit and talk with her. Sometimes the nurse practitioners have a good sense of this as well. That's a good idea. If you have a sense that emotionally she would have trouble handling it, I think that's entirely fine. One thought that you can do, and I think this is where it comes to her child saying to her and to you in 20 years' time, what, you knew and you didn't tell me? So there you have the opportunity for the pre-implantation genetics, and I suspect it may even be possible for your daughter not to know the answer. So there are ways to nuance your way through this that allow the disease to be stopped in its tracks, even if you don't really want to know the answer yourself. So that becomes a responsibility to the next generation, because you're making a decision for them that maybe they don't want you to make that way, but you have the power to make it for yourself. So that's exactly the sweet spot of the difficulty in the conversation. Everybody has a choice over their own lives, and they can make the decision one way or the other. She's young, she has a decision to make. You could imagine many circumstances. What, you knew and you didn't tell me? That's a very negative, destructive conversation. And I think if you keep that in mind, it empowers you to then take control in a way that avoids and averts that later possibility. Is that helpful?
That is helpful, yeah. I just want to make sure that there's consideration given to that aspect of it. Because it becomes very scientific, and of course that's important to know how to see treatment, but the emotional side of it really.
The emotional side of it is critically important, and I think in that sense, so maybe I dwelled a little too much on the sense of agency and empowerment without talking about the other side of that, which is the downside of knowing something like that. I think that paying attention to that and counseling and support through it is part of what goes on in an environment like this. And so I thank you for bringing that up, and I think it's exactly a very important point. Yep.
Whole exome testing, and nothing has shown up on the genetic side. Is it true that there are that beyond the reading of the results by the lab, there are some more sophisticated opportunities to have the results read that could show up a genetic ataxia? Could you comment on that?
I can. I'm not a geneticist, so the intricacies of how this is done are beyond me, but I can tell you that firstly, the detailed analysis through bioinformatics of the exome results can be more helpful. But remember that the exome is about 1% of our genetic makeup that makes the proteins that can go wrong. The other 99% are basically backseat drivers telling the 1% what to do. And that genetic structure, the genome, contains a lot of information that can also be causative for ataxia. So as genome testing becomes more widely available, we may be able to solve that problem of the repeat disorder negative, exome negative, hopefully get to genome testing in people in whom there is a clear Mendelian pattern, autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked, and mitochondrial. So I think that the science is evolving, and for vexing cases like yours where the genetics haven't given the answer, I think that there is hope that as the science of genetics makes its way more into the clinical realm, we'll be able to give the answer that you're so desperately looking for. And your scenario, I think, makes it clear why looking for the answer is so important, because it helps you put the full stop at the end of the sentence and allows you to move on to the next stage.
Thanks, Dr.
Thanks, folks. Good luck.
So now I think I'm going to go get retested and have my genes done. Next is the highlights to the AIM conference that was going on preceding this one here. And I want to introduce Dr. Albert Laspada. He's from Duke University, and he was newly selected as Director of Neuroregeneration and Neurotherapeutics. He's a professor at Duke and also the Vice Chair of the Department of Neurology. And Dr. Gulan Oz, she is an imaging specialist in magnetic resonance spectroscopy. I keep wanting to say MRI, but it's MRS, at the University of Minnesota. It's a non-invasive way of reading chemicals and neurotransmitters in the brain that could help eventually lead to early onset detection of ataxia. Please welcome Dr. Oz and Dr. Laspada.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So we are tasked with my co-chair, Dr. Al Laspada, to give you a quick overview of the AIM meeting that started on Monday, what we have discussed, what were some of the highlights. So if I can have the slides. Okay. And I'll do the first about 15 minutes, and Al will take over the last 15 minutes, and then we'll finish up together. So here's our disclaimer. We do receive some funding from pharmacy. So I did this last time. I think it's a nice way to show how these ataxia investigators meetings have evolved. I started coming to the AIMS in 2008. Unfortunately, I have pictures starting in 2010, Chicago meeting. Here's me and Al at that meeting. And just look at these pictures and tell me if you can pick up how they have evolved. So here's 2012, 2014, 2016, and this is the last one. We couldn't even fit everyone in. Here's this person, unfortunately, cut in the middle. Any trends that you notice? Yep. So here we are in 2005, where there were 50 investigators. And these are biannual meetings, and here we are in 2018. The last two AIMS attracted about 170 investigators from around the world. That is more than tripling. This is good news. So, and those people, even though this is the National Ataxia Foundation sponsored AIM meeting, this is a highly international meeting. So we had this time 169 attendees from 13 different countries shown here. This is intercontinental, and I can't tell you enough, I can't emphasize enough how important this is to actually initiate, launch international efforts. We started doing over the last year intercontinental imaging studies, for example, that we had not done previously. We were doing our work in the United States, our European colleagues were doing their work, and now we have some common grant mechanisms where we will join our hands, and this is really the only way we can do some very rigorous, serious work that can affect the worldwide population. So this is very exciting. So another important piece here was that more than half of the attendees were first-time attendees. That means we are attracting new investigators to this field. About half were junior investigators. That's big. We need new blood, new ideas, new types of new questions coming from fresh minds. It's also important to notice that National Institutes of Health highly supports this work. We had representatives from 2 institutes at the NIH, and they sponsor our meeting, and they give us a lot of valuable feedback on where we are going. This is another important piece, the number of sponsors other than NAF. So this includes industry sponsors, other patient organizations, as well as NIH institutes. So this historic data is from Sue Hagen. They started out with 4 non-NAF sponsors, and now we are at 17. That shows you the level of interest. Perhaps most critically, the industry representation at the meeting has increased a lot. So we had 25 attendees. This is 15% of the attendees coming from industry. They were representing 14 companies. What does that mean? They are either currently working on some ataxia treatments or are very interested in initiating work in these areas. And 10 of them actually sponsored the meeting. So that's pretty big. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to Al now.
We have another microphone in case we need it. Okay. So I'm just going to continue and try and go into greater detail in terms of the substance of the meeting, in terms of the science and some of the themes that we emphasize, just to give you guys a very brief sense of that. So there were really 4 main goals of this particular meeting. One was to sort of engage in an up-to-date review of cutting-edge research, so everyone gets caught up on what are the most important emerging ideas in the ataxia field. The other thing was to share strategies for ataxia research between different medical centers. As you just learned, we have mostly people from the U.S., but we have many, many investigators from across the world, many from Europe in particular, but also from Asia as well. We wanted to identify the most important topics in ataxia research because we want to move this field forward as quickly as possible. And a very important theme that was already touched on by Dr. Oz is we want to cultivate the next generation of ataxia researchers and clinicians, and we want to connect them up with you guys, with ataxia patients. So in terms of cutting-edge research, one thing we emphasized in our first theme was basic cerebellar function, and this idea that the neurons that degenerate in disease, they don't sort of exist in a vacuum, but they're communicating with other neurons in the central nervous system and also with other types of cells, because your brain actually, only 10% of it is made up of neurons, and most of the cells in your brain are what are called glia, and they play a special role. I won't go into the details, but we emphasize the relationship of these cells to the neurons in terms of understanding how the cerebellum works and how it dysfunctions. Also, a major theme was to identify therapeutic targets, and at this meeting we talked about the role of DNA damage, oxidative stress, and mitochondrial dysfunction. And another important thing is to make models so that when we have ideas about new therapies, we can test them in these models. So we talked about the importance of mouse models and what makes them good and what makes them not so good, and then using human stem cell models where we make neurons from your skin cells using an advanced technology that was developed just really a few years ago, but now has come into the mainstream of our research. Another important goal was, in terms of sharing therapeutic strategies, was to talk about getting ready for clinical trials and also drug development for rare diseases. So really to position ourselves to be able to have the most effective possible trials of new drug therapies as they become available. And it's important to note we have had, between the last meeting and this meeting, our first real ataxia clinical trial, and the results of that trial that was led by the company Biohaven were reported at this meeting we just had. So in terms of some highlights, again, cultivating the next generation of researchers, we can't emphasize how important that is because we want to bring, the best people into the field. Because there's a lot of bright people, medical students and researchers, PhD researchers. They could work on anything. We want to show them that this is a vibrant and important topic where they'll have opportunities and can make a difference. So we want to bring trainees in contact with patients, and I think we did that through a few different venues, as you'll hear. We wanted to emphasize that we valued the contribution of young people, so they gave half the talks at this meeting, actually. And for the first time at this meeting, we had a little pre-meeting where we had trainees come together into what we call a trainee network program, and that was really exceedingly successful. Dr. Oz organized that, and the people who participated were thrilled, and they asked for more. So I'm quite confident that we will do it when we have this meeting again in 2 years. And overall, the goal here was to just empower these trainees to feel like they could really come into this field and make a difference. In terms of identifying the most important topics in this ataxia research field, well, we had internationally renowned award-winning researchers who presented at this meeting. I mean, we had some of the big names in the field who came to this meeting. The topics were wide-ranging. We covered new areas that had never been discussed before at the prior meetings to show you how dynamic, the research is in this field. And we added 2 debate sessions where, 2 sets of our esteemed colleagues debated important and controversial issues in the field of ataxia research and therapy development. And that was spirited, it was fun, but most of all, it was really informative and instructive. And again, establishing future leaders of ataxia research, we have this Hot Chairs program where we can get 12 individuals to come up and briefly talk about their work, adding more opportunities for individuals to do that, and all but one of those individuals were early stage investigators or trainees. And of course, the thing that we feel very passionately about is having our trainees come into contact with patients. So really they understand, what they're doing. They're working in labs, they have tissue and other biological samples in test tubes. It's very impersonal. But when they meet people and they understand, where these samples come from, why, they're doing this work, why they're working these long hours, it really is very motivating for them. And so at the Thursday night dinner, we had, obviously all the trainees were there for this, and we had ataxia patients and families, and we had 3 presentations. This was the first time that many of our trainees ever heard how patients think and how they feel about their disease, and I can assure you that the response was uniform. The words I heard over and over again was that this was inspirational and this was motivating. So, it was really, I think, a highlight of the meeting for our trainees. And we also had a poster session yesterday where patients and families were able to come and see what our trainees are doing in terms of their research, and again, an opportunity to meet with them one-on-one. I thought it was very well attended and very valuable. And so now I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Oz, who's going to take us out here.
So this picture that I stole off the internet is just to give you an idea about the complexity of what we are trying to do. So this is just a representation of of the scales of the brain. And to tell you that at this meeting we have people who are working on a single cell basis, for example, investigating ways that neighboring neurons communicate with each other. Then there are people who look at circuits, how this part of your brain talks to this part, or how your cerebellum talks to the rest of your brain. And then this is again a network idea, from synapses to layers of your cerebellum to the whole brain level. And then we have a lot of people who work at the whole animals and whole humans. We have a lot of physician scientists who work at this level. And you do really need to study the diseases and understand at all those different levels. Now, having people working on such different levels and with such varied backgrounds, we have biologists, geneticists, physicists, chemists, mathematicians, engineers come here. We don't really speak each other's language. We are all scientists, but I'm not well versed in genetics language, for example, or my colleagues may not be well versed in imaging language that we use on a day-to-day basis. So we really learn how to speak each other's language and how to communicate, understand the issues with other techniques and other approaches that our colleagues take. So this is really a wonderful opportunity for all these people with all these different diverse backgrounds to get together and work on the same ultimate goal, to bring some treatments. And we do shape each other's research. My research has evolved over the years because of the feedback I got from my physician scientist colleagues and from my basic geneticist, molecular biologist colleagues. So that it really does take a village to grow a scientist and then to allow them and support them to flourish. So I'd like to tell you about the future aim that Al will chair. These are tentative dates and tentative location that will be in 2020. This was our steering committee. We had a larger than usual committee this time, but it was great. We had a great mixture of earlier investigators and senior investigators, basic scientists and physician scientists, and I think it worked quite well. We had, I really enjoyed preparing this program with all of them. And of course, NAF staff and volunteers like David, who takes beautiful pictures. Without their help, this meeting is not possible. And Sue, Sue's contribution, I cannot emphasize it. I mean, without her, AIM doesn't exist. So, few words on how you can help. I'm sure during the exhibitors area at this meeting you have heard about the registry courts. Your participation in that is highly, highly important. Check out clinicaltrials.gov for ongoing trials. These may be treatment trials or other multi-site initiatives to understand natural history of these diseases, how they progress with imaging markers, for example. Check those out. And NAF has a nice website, How You Can Help, so that's a very good resource. And then I have some pictures here from a beautiful hike we took to help raise funds for NAF. This was the 6460 campaign last year. I think this year it's called Go the Extra Mile. And you can see we had a couple of members of the AIM organizing committee here, Maria and myself, and our families. And this gentleman here is standing in the back there, Larry Scott, whose uncle founded NAF, and he did this hike, 60-mile hike, at the age of 80. So with determination, you can help in many different ways. This organization support this research. And thank you very much for supporting the research and inspiring us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Espada and Dr. Oz. And did you notice from yesterday, I was here for the Living with Ataxia panel, Linda mentioned about introductions. I kind of used that as a hug and introduction for Dr. Oz when I stumbled on stage. It worked out perfectly. It is kind of embarrassing when it happens, but it does. Next one, I introduced the panel for managing ataxia. The panel is brought up by Dr. John Day from Stanford University. He's a professor of neurology and pediatrics and director of neuroscience, neuromedicine, and the neurogenetics clinic. And on panel will be Amanda Gallagher. She is a speech and language specialist from Johns Hopkins Ataxia Unit, Brain and Stroke Rehab Program. Dr. Liana Rosenthal. She's a professor of neurology at Johns Hopkins University and the director of the Ataxia Clinic at Johns Hopkins since 2013. And my favorite research physical therapist, Jen Keller from the Center for Movement Studies, Kennedy Kruger Institute in Baltimore, where I've been her personal guinea pig for many years. Please welcome Amanda Gallagher, Dr. Rosenthal, Jen Keller, and Dr. Day.
So thank you very much. It's really great to be here. Thank you. It's been a long morning. Why don't we take a 2-minute break, and those of you who can stand up and stomp your feet or something. We would like you all to wake back up. You know, it gets a little bit tiring and soporific to be sitting there this entire time. Come on, Al. And those of you who can't stand, you know, turn your wheelchairs in a circle or something, get a different perspective, or wave your hands, or take a deep few breaths. I think, you know, we can all benefit from movement. I'm excited that I might get to sit. Which is actually part of what we want to talk about. I'm also, while you're standing, going to frame this. I think oftentimes we come to the annual ataxia meeting to hear about the latest in research. And that's always exciting, but I want to make 2 points about why taking care of yourself is so important in the research effort. As you may know, to do the research that's going to bring a drug to market is going to cost companies between $100 and $200 million. And they get really fussy and paranoid about the people that they involve in their studies. So I think we can go ahead and sit back down. And so that the sponsors of the clinical research trials that are going to be bringing the exciting new treatments to clinic really care about what kind of care each of the patients is getting. If they think they're involving someone in a trial who might fall and break a leg, they don't want to do that because that is a black mark against their new drug. And so they are going to be very careful, and they want to make sure that everybody that is participating in clinical research is taking care of themselves, because that's the foundation on which we can actually develop these new treatments. And a second point I'll just make about these new and exciting treatments is that none of them is going to be a magic wand. We are not going to poof, get rid of ataxia with any of the new things that come. There will still be other aspects of ataxia left that we need to confront and come up with new approaches to, and involvement in your comprehensive care clinics is going to be really, really critical with that in mind. So given that, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists and have them each kind of introduce what they think was each chose their primary topic they wanted to emphasize today, and then we're going to open up and answer questions that you have all submitted so that we can address things going forward. So the first person is Jen Keller, who, as you have already heard, is a research physical therapist at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, where she has been working on movement disorder studies to improve rehabilitation for people with neurological disorders for more than 15 years. So, Jen, what kind of issues do you think are most prominent or important for these guys to think about?
Well, thank you very much for having me today. I think we've heard a lot about how rehabilitation is so important for ataxia at the meeting, and you know very well that balance and coordination are a high component of that. But I'm not sure if we touched very much on, in addition, that motor learning can be impaired. So relearning a new task, or getting your motor performance better can be more challenging, and so that requires specific strategies and intensive work, and it may take a little bit longer period of time to see that. So I think it's mostly important that you, when you do approach going through rehab, that you get treatments that are specific to you and that are directed to what it is that you want to achieve. So those would be my main points about exercise and rehab. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. And Dr. Leanna Rosenthal, who, as we have heard, runs the Johns Hopkins program for ataxia. The Ataxia Center since 2013 actually came from Duke, which was a very reputable place even before Dr. Laspada moved there, and has been at Johns Hopkins for many years in training in neurology and in movement disorders. So, Leanna, what did you want to emphasize?
So there really were two main management points that I wanted to talk about today. The first is the importance of patients and their families feeling empowered to be part of the medical team and part of their care team, and then also this idea that there's always something we can do to help. So in terms of that first idea, I really want patients to think of themselves as partnering with everyone in their care team, because we are all trying to help you to achieve your current goals. The idea is, how can we make your quality of life better now? And so we don't know when you walk in the door what's important to you. And so it's really critical that you help explain the way that this disease is impacting your life and your family's life, and you explain it and tell us, these are the things I want to work on. And we may not be able to work on everything, and we may not be able to make everything 100% better, but we can certainly target the symptoms that you want to have addressed at each visit. And so I think it's really important that you come to a visit prepared. So I have patients write down lots of questions. We want to make sure we answer your questions. You should feel empowered to know how to get in touch with your entire care team in between appointments. So some folks like email, some folks prefer phone calls. You should be able to talk with everyone in your care team, the neurologist, the physical therapist, the speech therapist, occupational therapist, geneticist, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists. All of these people should be in your care team. And I think this is probably the other background point is you should really work to assemble a care team. And so for those of you who don't live in a place where there are lots of people who know what ataxia is, it may mean that you walk into your neurologist's office with a bunch of information about ataxia. And hopefully that person is a partner with you in learning more about the disease and in seeing what they can do to help you. So you should feel empowered to educate the people who are treating you, and you should feel empowered to ask questions and to emphasize the things that are really important to you. And then the other thing I think is my own personal pet peeve, when I hear from patients that their doc said, there's nothing I can do to help you. And I understand that based on the research lectures we heard, I understand and we all know that as of right now in this moment, there is no cure. And we would love there to be a cure, but right now there isn't. So the question then is, what can we do to help you right now? And there is always something we can do to help you right now, to make your quality of life just a little bit better. I'm not going to tell you it's going to be perfect and you're running marathons and everything is back to how it was before you had symptoms from these diseases, but what can we do to make things a little bit better for you right now? And there's always something we can do for that. So those are sort of the two main points of creating a care team, empowering yourself to work with your care team, and to really think about the things that are important for you to try to address as best as we are able to do so right now.
Excellent. I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up about, there's nothing you can do now. Nothing gets my blood boiling faster than hearing that comment.
Exactly.
Because it is abjectly, provably untrue.
I agree.
And it's absolutely to help you live your life more fully and independently now, but there's also good evidence that it can slow down the rate of progression, forestall the age of onset, that, really taking care of yourself is critical. And as I previously mentioned, it also lays the foundation on which we can do the new research to develop the new treatments. They go hand in glove. You don't get one without the other. Okay. And that's really key, I think. So Dr. Amanda Gallagher, we already heard, speech and language pathologist, also at Johns Hopkins, also have been there for 15 years and done a lot in terms of research and investigation and patient care. So what were kind of the key things that you thought this audience needed to hear about?
Sure. Good morning. This morning I would really like a chance to touch base on two additional areas to put on folks' radar when it comes to managing ataxia, and those areas are difficulty with swallowing, so the medical term is dysphagia, but difficulty with swallowing, importantly, I think, most importantly, what to look for to know if I might be having difficulty with swallowing, and then what do I do to follow up, who do I talk with, and what management techniques are out there. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that this morning. And another area that I think is important for folks to have on their radar is thinking about cognitive changes that can happen with ataxia. So things like short-term memory, attention skills, problem-solving skills. I just want the opportunity to let people know that if changes like this are happening, there are exercises to do, there are strategies to use to help make day-to-day life easier and manageable, and to remain independent with the things that you want to do on a day-to-day basis. So there are things that can be done to help with cognitive changes, and your local friendly speech pathologist or occupational therapist can help you in those areas as well.
Great, thank you. People often wonder what the role of the neurologist is in the clinic, because our discipline used to be primarily focused on diagnosis. And okay, I've got the diagnosis, what's the neurologist doing for me? And I think the neurologist oftentimes ends up in this situation oftentimes being kind of the orchestra conductor. We have the great opportunity of working with specialists who know a lot more than we do about physical therapy and how muscles move bones, and with working with speech and language pathologists who know a lot more about the muscles of the throat and the mouth and how you swallow and speak. And we're the coordinators. We often try to prioritize, what the issues are and put them in the context of what we understand is the underlying issue in terms of any one person's issues. So a lot of what we do is that kind of coordination of care. Two of the other elements of care that we don't have on stage that I emphasize oftentimes are sleep, which is a critical issue and often disrupted in different ways, and nothing can screw up your life faster than having poor sleep. I know I see a lot of patients and they'll tell me, oh, sleep isn't my problem. I can sleep like a log. In fact, I'm sleeping 16 hours a day. That's not a great sign. If you can sleep that much, it's usually an indication that the quality of your sleep has suffered. And so your body is emphasizing quantity over quality. And if we can work with you, we can improve the quality of your sleep so that you don't have to sleep as long. So that's number one. And number two is nutrition. And I think that that's a big, broad topic, and it involves a number of different disciplines. But one of them that kind of gets back to things that Amanda was talking about is swallowing. And I have yet to meet a person who came onto this planet wishing that they had a feeding tube. I mean, it's something that a lot of people will put off and put off and put off, even when they're having significant trouble swallowing. And I'm just going to put in a plug for it, that feeding tube technology has improved tremendously over the last several decades, to the point where we can install a feeding tube. Nobody needs to know you have it. You can get most of your nutritional needs met. You can make sure you're staying well hydrated. You can use it for medication. And you can still eat things that you can eat safely and enjoy, so that it can markedly improve your life. A lot of people end up eating very, very carefully. And to get the nutrition they need can take enormous amounts of time, because they have to eat so slowly and carefully to avoid choking on it or running into other issues. So that I really do think that feeding tubes play an important role, and I want to decrease, the fear of them, the worry about having them, and if you get it placed and you don't like it, you can have it removed. But that has never happened in all of the hundreds of patients I've worked with that have gotten feeding tubes. So just a word to try to bring that down. As I tell my patients in clinic, the first time I bring this up, you're going to hate it, you're going to go home, and you're not going to want to talk about it again. But on the second or third time when you come in, we might begin to have a little more rational, less emotional concern about it and discuss that. There are many other aspects of nutrition we're not going to get into, because I don't know enough about it, but for one reason. Let me toss this back to Dr. Rosenthal. So one of the other questions that came up a lot was alternative care. I mean, if you guys don't have specific treatments for this, what can we do in terms of other ways of treating ataxia?
So there were a number of questions about alternative therapies, and a couple points I wanted to make. I think when people think about alternative therapies, they usually start thinking about things that, my regular doctor doesn't know much about, or things that my regular doctor wouldn't approve of, oftentimes also comes up. And I think people usually also think of things, supplements they can buy over the counter themselves usually fall under how people are defining alternative therapies. And then people also, I hear a lot of talk about things like acupuncture, massage, stem cells, hyperbaric oxygen chamber treatments, and a whole host of supplements, sometimes prescribed by patients' naturopath. A couple of guiding principles, and I don't want to get into the weeds about, well, what about this supplement and what about that supplement, but a few sort of guiding principles. There are some very specific forms of ataxia where very specific supplements make a difference. So Dr. Lynch was speaking earlier about the coenzyme Q10 deficiency related ataxia. For those patients who have a CoQ10 deficiency, taking CoQ10 makes a lot of sense, and it treats them, and it's amazing, and it's great. And you should talk with your doctor about whether or not he or she has tested for those very specific forms of ataxia where we know these supplements that are considered sort of more alternative, we know they work. So you can talk with your doctor about that. But a couple other guiding principles when it comes for everyone to think about when they're thinking about what these alternative therapies. So first of all, always discuss with your neurologist what you have done, are planning to do, are thinking about doing. I really like it when my patients come to me and say, I'm thinking about taking this supplement, or I'm thinking about trying this treatment. What do you think? We know there are a lot of things about ataxia, about medicine, about our bodies that the medical community doesn't know that much about. And so the guiding principle here is you really should think about things that are not going to cause harm, that are not overly expensive, and especially a huge red flag is something that's really expensive that is not covered by your insurance company. That is a huge red flag, and I don't want to get into the exact details of what I personally as a physician would and would not recommend people get into, but the more critical point is that you come to your doctor and say, this is what I'm thinking, and your doctor needs to know what you're taking. So if you are taking some extra supplements prescribed by someone else, CBD oil and marijuana and THC have come up a lot lately. If you are thinking about that, you need to partner with your doctor because we need to know all the different things you're taking and all the different things you're doing. So the other thing to keep in mind, research is not a straight line by which to say it's not like every article published builds on the one before and continues to prove that something is working. One study does not mean that whatever supplement addition, etc., is safe and effective. Because the way research is usually done is it's done on a handful of patients, maybe 30 or 40, and they're on the supplement or they get the treatment for 8-10 weeks. And that does not prove that something is safe or effective. It just means that in this particular study, they happened to get a significant result. They ran the numbers, they did the statistics. We need to get, and most physicians feel much more comfortable when there's a growing preponderance of evidence that something is helpful. So if you find that one study published somewhere that this one supplement was effective and safe, it does not mean it actually is. It doesn't mean it's not, but it doesn't mean it is. So I really encourage you to partner with your doctor, and again, be very wary of things that are really, really expensive. And I would even think about that as a bit of a cost-benefit. So if you're going to spend $3,000 on a very expensive, not FDA-approved treatment, my personal argument usually is take that money, get a personal trainer, go to physical therapy, because we know that exercise is an alternative non-pharmacologic therapy that works. And there's really good evidence both on the cellular level from the meeting we just had and on the patient level, some of the research that Dr. Keller did. We know that exercise works. And there's a whole bunch of different very specific forms of exercise that can work. And Jen can talk more about that. But the idea is that if you're going to spend money on something really expensive, put it towards something that we know works. And exercise has been shown time and again in every study to absolutely improve current function and may even slow disease course. So I would really, when you're thinking about alternative therapies, I would think about it with those guiding principles in mind, talk with your doctor. Don't forget about exercise and speech therapy and all the therapies that we prescribe as alternative, because they're non-pharmacologic therapies that absolutely have been proven to work, as opposed to some of these other things that haven't been proven. And this isn't to say don't do those other things, but be sure to partner with your doctor about what you are thinking and why you are thinking this and why you want to try this supplement and what symptoms you're having that you're trying to address, because there may be multiple ways of going about it. So that is the guiding principle. Maybe you can add more about the exercise specificity.
I think someone brought up yesterday Tai Chi, and there are a lot of different ways that you can enjoy exercise that can be fun, or it doesn't have to be through a strict like a rehabilitation physical therapy program. Although I think I will always advocate that that's a good place to start, so that you know where your deficits are, so that you know where you should target what it is you have to work on. On a personal note, I have started training in Tai Chi with a program called Tai Chi Health, which they have partnered with physical therapists to develop a program using, you can use it from a walker level or from seated and work well on your balance. But I think it's like everything else. It's hard to find providers in the exercise world that are familiar with something neurological. So you may have to educate them, or you may need to get them to just have a few pointers from your physical therapist or from your physician about what things they might need to look out for. But I think there's a lot of different opportunities. In fact, Jen Miller, the physical therapist at the Ataxia Center, also recommended that I mention to you that they have an Ataxia Sailing Day in Baltimore on June 9th, and it's free, and she promises that they are the most accessible, and they do not capsize the boats in any way. They're very safe, and if you pick up a flyer at their table, you can see that Mike and his family are the photo specialty for having done it last year, and I've heard great things about it. So even that's like an interesting, unusual way that you might get to experience the water and get more activity, which can be beneficial as well. So.
No, I think that's great. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think everybody can exercise, and I think saying, "Well, I'm in a wheelchair now," does not mean you can't undertake some forms of exercise. It's a matter of being creative, coming up with things that work, identifying some goals that are appropriate, but it has all kinds of benefit for everybody. In terms of the alternative care, I also kind of say something similar, about don't spend your bottom dollar on these things, because some of them, we have a lot of kind of medical tourism where people will head off to different countries where they can get the stem cell infusion or whatever it is. And I usually just suggest that they don't exhaust their resources doing that. But resources aren't only money. I mean, some patients have enough money that they can do it, but they can exhaust their time and exhaust their energy in seeking these alternative approaches. And so I think you just have to be very judicious in these things that haven't been proven yet. And I think if we can talk with you about it, we can oftentimes discuss it. Never preclude it. We want to be working with you as part of the team. And we realize, the frustration that can come along with some of these chronic disorders. So I think it's something that we just need to maintain that dialogue about. Dr. Gallagher, I'm curious about your take on something that came up from a number of people that wrote in questions about the rules of insurance. That getting rehabilitation in almost any domain used to mean that you had to set a goal and be able to show improvement towards that goal. What's the current state of that?
Yes, so I can speak. This morning, I think the most beneficial area of insurance to focus on would be Medicare, and I know many people had questions about Medicare, whether or not it covers maintenance therapy now. So just the very general overview when it comes to the rehabilitation side of Medicare coverage, so physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. Basically, the way it boils down is that Medicare has a pot of money that they will allot to anyone who has Medicare coverage, and the physical therapy and speech therapy share 1/2 of that pot of money, and then OT gets the other half of money, occupational therapy. And there are caps put in place. So right now the current cap is $2,010. And what the cap means is it is not a hard stop. So the hard stop was repealed, thank goodness. That $2,010 is basically a checkpoint. So any clinic that you go to receive therapy services, the clinic is going to track how much money has been billed for each of the therapy services, because then they need to give the therapist a heads up. When you hit that $2,010 for your PT and speech therapy combined, or the $2,010 for occupational therapy, that then requires the therapist to add an extra piece to our documentation to show Medicare, yes, we're aware that we've hit this amount of money, and yes, it is our professional clinical opinion that this skilled service is still necessary. So maintenance therapy is now an option with the caveat of the maintenance therapy will be covered if it goes beyond that $2,000 mark, if the therapist can show that the maintenance therapy needs to have skilled clinical intervention. So what that means is if we as the therapist can train you or a family member or a caregiver who is in your life to do the same exercises or the same techniques with you at home, then it's not a skilled service. You don't need the therapist to provide that with you if we can train someone else to do that. And that is where Medicare will say, then we're not going to cover that maintenance because it doesn't have to be the therapist doing it. But if it does, if there is a skilled need, then they are now open and willing. Now, I should also put out there, to be fair, that Medicare never guarantees that it's going to pay for anything even below that cap level. And it also doesn't say we're going to cut anything off at that cap level. So it's important that you keep an open dialogue with your therapist and your care team about how am I doing with my goals? And they should be providing you this information anyway, but if not, advocate for yourself. How am I doing with my goals? What are my goals? If you weren't able to be an active part of setting those goals, what am I working toward here? What kind of progress do we need to see for you, the therapist, to be able to continue to advocate that this skilled service is necessary? And when do you, as the therapist, think that the skilled side of things might be wrapping up? And when you're asking those questions and keeping that open dialogue, then you have the opportunity to advocate for yourself if you're feeling like, no, I don't think this is an option for me at home for someone to help me out. I don't think that I can do this on my own, and here's why. It's helpful for the therapist to know that information, to be able to document appropriately and advocate for you as well. Jen, is there any big pieces that I'm missing? I think that about covers it.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah,
that was good.
So it is good news. It's great news because not that long ago, well, sadly, not that long ago, there weren't a lot of questions asked. Maybe 15 years ago, you could get pretty much anything that you wanted as long as a physician or a therapist was saying, yeah, this is necessary. Then things tightened up a bit and got more tricky, maybe 10 years ago. And I'm glad to see that things are shifting back to what I think is a more reasonable standpoint, which is these benefits are there because people need these benefits. And we also need to be judicious about, between the patient and the therapist, making sure that we're justifying that these benefits are really necessary right now, because you're also looking at this pot of money over the course of a year. So let's say you're in therapy in January, February, March. You may want to save some of that money if you can be doing the exercises at home with assistance. You may want to save some of that pot for yourself for later in the year, because as we know in therapy is generally not a once and done, right? Things change. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but things change, and you want to be able to follow up with that provider to update your exercises and take new stock of how things are going day to day. So having that open communication of what are we working on and why, and ask your therapist if they're not sharing with you, what are you seeing, how long do you think I'm going to need this, so that it's a collaborative planning process, and so that you can make judicious use, of those benefits. And I mean, to keep it very Very brief. Oftentimes, commercial insurances follow Medicare guidelines because Medicare is the most strict of the guidelines, so oftentimes they follow Medicare rules as well, but that is a little bit different based on which commercial company there is.
I guess I could just add, if you have more of an interest in looking at it, there's the CMS has a website, and it's JIMMO, JIMMO, which would give you more details about how this works. And you can also refer your provider to it if they need more information on it. But also, I was at a recent meeting about this, and they did discuss that a number of the plans that manage the Medicare things, they're not as familiar necessarily with this factor, so you may need to go back to your care management person and discuss with them and let them know, that this is a new change in the practice, and they may just need that information as well. So,
and know that therapy is never a closed door. So regardless of what's going on with insurance at one snapshot moment in time, that does not mean that it's going to be the same occurrence 6 months from now. So never, I would like to say never shy from at least having an evaluation done if you feel like there's been a change, so that you can talk with the provider as to whether or not a new round of therapy is appropriate and necessary and available, because we're always there and things change.
No, I think that's great, and I hope it makes sense to people. I mean, it was just a couple of years ago, one of my former patients, actually the father of one of my former patients, who was involved in one of the suits 2 years ago that came to the settlement because the old rule used to be that you had to achieve a certain goal, and so you'd get short-term benefit therapy kind of programs. So we used to have to be really creative. We'd say, okay, you're going to therapy now for that pain in your right hip. And that got us 10 weeks of care. And then we'd say, okay, now you're going for the pain in your left hip. And that'd get us another 10 weeks. And then, oh my gosh, your lower back. Okay, so that gets you another 10 weeks. And it really, it was really challenging and kind of skirting the law to some extent. And so this lawsuit came, and the ruling came down 2 years ago, I think, that if we can show benefit, not necessarily improvement, that was the problem in the past. So I do think this is good. I do think it forces us to kind of reconsider goals and how to do it, but it allows us a lot more flexibility. One of the other key members of our care team that gets involved in this is the social worker, because again, there's just a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of back and forth trying to figure out how we're going to appease these insurers and keep things going. So Medicare made its ruling, and eventually I think the other private insurers are all kind of coming online. They usually do. But it's to their advantage to drag their feet, and so it's up to us to keep advocating for it. So that's where we're at with that. So I think that's really key. All right. So let's see other issues that came up. So Dr. Rosenthal, how about this issue of vertigo? We keep hearing about vertigo as part of ataxia.
So a couple things. I wanted to start off by really defining vertigo and dizziness. And I do this because when you talk to a neurologist about, Doc, I'm really dizzy, one of the key things is the question is why. And so the first question I always ask my patients is, when you say dizzy, do you mean the room is spinning? Do you mean you feel lightheaded when you stand up? Do you mean that when you turn your head, it takes a moment for the world to focus? What is the reason behind you're calling it dizziness, and I understand it is a thoroughly uncomfortable sensation, but I want to understand more about what you really mean. Do you mean the lightheadedness? Is the world spinning? You also want to, basically, I always ask lots of questions about, does this happen all the time? Does it happen some of the time? Does it happen only when you look to the left? Does it happen when you're driving? Does it happen when you're in the grocery store? Does it happen when you wake up in the morning and you go from lying down to standing up? So we want to ask all of these questions because the dizziness can come from a whole host of reasons. So I am sure there are more reasons than this, but the ones that I came up with off the top of my head quickly were things about eye movements. So for a lot of folks with ataxia, when you move their eyes, you don't hit right to the target. You sometimes go a little bit past the target and come back, or you don't quite make it to the target and you have to do another little jump to get to exactly the right spot. And so when you do that, that moment of waiting till your eyes focus can absolutely cause a sensation of what a patient would describe as dizziness. So for people in the room who don't have ataxia, it's the same sensation if you've had 3, 4, 6, 8 drinks, and you go and you turn your head quickly, and it takes a moment for the world to catch up. My understanding of it is that sensation, or so I've been told. So that is one reason that people can describe dizziness. In addition, some of my patients describe dizziness as really the balance issue that comes with having ataxia. So when they're walking, your walking just isn't quite what it used to be. And it's described as a dizziness. I always feel like I'm a little bit off and a little bit off balance. And so that is sometimes the description of dizziness. You can also have this description of dizziness because you have a sensory loss in your feet. So one of the challenges with some of the forms of ataxia more than others is if you have a profound sensory loss in your feet, or even a mild to moderate loss in your feet, your ability to know where your body is in space goes down. So you have the sensory loss in your feet, the cerebellum isn't quite working the way it used to, and the combination makes you feel off and a little bit dizzy. And then finally, the other thing that people think about are the medications. And so one of the specific questions had to do with, do blood pressure medicines cause dizziness? And what I would interpret that is, some of the blood pressure medicines do what they're supposed to do. They lower your blood pressure. But when your blood pressure goes down, and especially if you're a little bit dehydrated and not drinking enough fluids, when you go from sitting to standing, you're going to feel a little bit lightheaded because your blood pressure is just too low for your body to recalibrate quickly and for you to feel okay. So in that regard, yes, some of the medications can cause dizziness, and some of the other medications that we use can sometimes contribute to that dizzy feeling and just feeling off in the head a little bit, just things that don't feel right. And so the things that we can think about and the things that are really important is that you talk with your doctor about, when you say dizziness and when you say vertigo, what do you mean? Do you mean that it takes a moment for the world to focus? Do you mean that your balance is off? Do you mean that you feel lightheaded when you stand up? And so you need to figure out what you mean by that. Talk with your doctor about that, because he or she can help tease this out for you. And then you can talk about specific ways of addressing that symptom. So certainly if you're feeling lightheaded when you stand up and you're on a really high dose of your blood pressure medicines, you may need to talk with your primary care doc about lowering those medicines, but that needs to be done in conjunction with making sure your blood pressure doesn't go too high. So you have to kind of balance all that out. And certainly the other thing that we're always talking with our patients about, because it's good for almost everything, is staying well hydrated. And so that's really a key take-home point, and is good for everything, including the dizziness feeling, including this, you feel better if you're well hydrated. If you're dehydrated, things just don't go as well. So that's certainly something that everybody can do, regardless of their blood pressure meds, regardless of their eye movements. Everyone should be staying well hydrated to help with this dizzy feeling and this vertigo. And then really it's about addressing the specific cause of what's making you feel dizzy and what's making you feel uncomfortable. And you can partner with your doc about how to do that. Certainly if swallowing issues are coming up and that's part of why you're not hydrating well, then there are things that we want to address about that. If it's urinary issues and a urinary urgency or frequency, and that's part of why you're not hydrating well because you need to get to the bathroom really quick, again, talk with your doctor about that, because there's sometimes things that we can do to help mitigate some of those issues. So really the take-home point is there are lots of causes of dizziness, and you need to talk with your doc to figure out which one you have, and then from there, how to go about addressing it.
That's great. I think that the hydration issue is really key, and it comes up all the time. I mean, one of the adaptive responses, if you have trouble getting to the bathroom, is to drink less. It's kind of one of those eureka moments. You go, wow, this is great. If I drink less, I'm not going to have to pee. I can just, avoid that issue altogether. Not a good plan. It is not a good plan. And so we need to help you come up with another plan so that you can stay well hydrated. So I think that's really key. When we think of therapy, we're often thinking of improving joint movements or improving strength or things, but balance has become another big area of rehabilitation.
It is, and actually to your point about having to go to the bathroom more often, I just feel like I should address that. So you use the same muscles to keep your balance that you do to stay continent and to breathe. And you don't want to have to choose breathing or being continent over staying balanced. So in order to stay hydrated, you need to plan to go to the restroom every 2 hours, then that's what you should do. You need your pelvic floor, your abdominal muscles, and your diaphragm all to work together to help you with your core stability when you're walking, and it should be dynamic. I think that the exercise world has gone really into you need to have a really strong core and how important that is. But if you squeeze your abdominal muscles all the time, then your diaphragm is getting pushed up on and your pelvic floor is getting pushed down on, and there's a lot of stress on those things. And I guess I might be diverging, but in New Zealand they do crazy studies, and they made people have a full bladder and then try and walk, and they can't walk as well, they can't keep their balance as well, and they have all of these other issues. So I think that it's a good thing to keep in mind about how you move and how to coordinate those two things. So, but if I could talk a little more about balance, because there were also a number of questions about that. What's the best type of balance exercises to do? If that's
that'd
good.
be great.
You have to forgive me. My notes are on my phone because I'm right-handed, and my right hand isn't really working out so well right now. So I think in terms of balance, the key thing that we found in some of our research studies is that that's what impacts your walking the most. And so if you can improve your balance, you will hopefully be able to improve your walking. I think it's important to start from a place of stability and see if you can get your balance, whether it's sitting or standing, in as stable with as little sway as possible. And then I think from there, that's when you start to add things like turning your head or reaching or moving your feet, maybe narrowing your base of support of your feet. I think all of those things, though, require you. Exercise now I think I said this yesterday, but exercise seems to be that intensity is very important. Whether you're trying to get better endurance but through riding a bike or running on a treadmill, or if you're wanting to improve your balance, you need to be at that good point. So to also touch on the swaying or where you feel imbalanced because your body's moving so much. I think you might all be familiar with when you stand up and you try and stand still with when you have ataxia. Often if you're challenged, your legs start shaking back and forth. And that could be a symptom similar to what Dr. Rosenthal was talking about with eye movements where they overshoot and need to come back. Your knees may be tremoring back and forth. It's like, oh, I missed where I needed to be stable. I need to go back to here. But now once again, you've gone too far in the other direction. And so you keep going back and forth. And I always tell everyone that if that's starting to happen, then you need to stop and regroup. You need to get yourself stable, and then you can move from there to try and challenge your balance again. I think it's more a principle of it's going to be a long-term practice, and it should be focused, and it should be daily but not exhausting. And it may actually have to, though, be at different times during the day because you have more fatigue at the end of the day. You may need to practice some of those easier things that are easier in the morning, in the evening, just to kind of be working on those points when you need them. And it may require your own attention to how am I feeling at this moment and what am I able to do or not able to do safely. There was a question about safety, more in terms of safety in the community, and I think I think as I thought about that more, I mean, you can always take a self-defense course if you're worried about that, but I think if I think about, you really want to be stable when you're out in the community. Like, it may require that you need an assistive device to be able to feel secure in your walking so that you don't have to be attending to so many more things that are going on around you, and that may give you a more sense of confidence that you are, able to negotiate where you are and be aware of your surroundings easier. And then you can, challenge yourself at home. Try walking in your house using the walls, or less assistance at the time. You may just want to vary that. I have a number of people tell me they just keep their walker in the car. They never use it in the house, but they know that they have it there when they go out to the grocery store or something like that.
I think that's great. I think sometimes people are afraid that if they're using an assistive device, that makes them more of a target. That it maybe the bad actors in society are more apt to pick on them, and I don't know if that's true or not. I guess I have more faith in humankind. But I definitely believe that if you are using an assistive device, that people will give you broader berth. They won't bump into you as often. They will tend to help you out or give you the opportunity to proceed without putting you at risk of falling. And so I think making sure that you yourself are balanced, often with an assistive device. This came up in the group that Amanda and I were in yesterday about, for a lot of people, using a walking stick is a great first assistive device, that people associate that with being athletic as opposed to a cane, which they associate with being disabled. And I think as a first step, that oftentimes can be a good point of initiation, but obviously it moves beyond that and we get into other assistive devices, but whatever is needed. We don't have a lot of time left. I wanted to come back to Amanda and see if you had other things that you wanted to address, and I'll kind of prompt you, I guess, a little bit. And another thing that came up in the group we were in yesterday is the cough. The cough, I mean, a lot of people don't realize, that having a cough is part of ataxia. And, again, like dizziness, it can be multifactorial, but
Sure.
A lot of it is in your realm.
Yes. So in the speech-language pathology realm, which, forgive me, speech-language pathologist is ironically a mouthful, and so for the rest of the conversation, I'm just going to refer to us as SLP to make my life a little bit easier here. So in the SLP realm, where cough comes into play is in thinking about difficulty with swallowing. There are a lot of different reasons that someone can be coughing. I will say this: if you have any type of chronic cough, it's not up to you to have to try to determine what's causing it. Let your doctor know as soon as you notice it, okay? Because it may be something, very benign, or it may be something that needs to be followed up on, but talk to your provider. In the swallowing world, if you're noticing the cough is directly related to swallowing liquids, swallowing solids, or trying to swallow your pills, those are 3 good reasons to let your doctor know, I think I might be having some difficulty with swallowing. Also, if you are noticing a spike in your temperature, so if you notice that you run a low-grade fever right after meals, like a half an hour after meals, and then you feel fine again later, and then you have another meal, and you don't feel so good, and you have this low fever, that can be a sign of swallowing difficulty, with or without a cough. And then any signs of respiratory infection or pneumonia. So a productive cough, if you're coughing anything up, be it food or liquid or mucus itself. If you're running a fever, you want to let your doctor know right away. The reason it's important is because with swallowing difficulty, we're trying to make sure that we cover a couple of areas. Number one, swallowing safety. So if you're having trouble swallowing, it can put you at risk for choking on food, not being able to breathe because something is in the airway that's not supposed to be there. It can also put you at risk for respiratory infection and pneumonia. It can put you at risk for dehydration, which we've talked about today is a huge... I also agree. Remaining hydrated is important across the board when you're talking about the body. It's important for thinking skills. It's important for having a healthy, strong voice. It's important for your energy level and being able to do even small tasks on up to the most complicated tasks in the day. So swallowing difficulty can really have a big impact on hydration and also nutrition. So if you're having difficulty swallowing, you may not be eating as much as you usually would, and so you're not getting the calories that you need, and you may be losing weight. You're certainly losing energy that your body is needing to do day-to-day tasks and exercises. So some other symptoms, though. So cough is important, and it's one I think that's probably the most noticeable. Certainly choking is a very noticeable symptom and one that people are super aware of, but some others also are either watery eyes, or if your nose is running when you eat or drink or take your pills, that can be a sign that you're having some difficulty. And like I talked about, fever. Also this, it's called a globus sensation, but just that sensation that something's kind of always caught right here. And you cough and you clear your throat and you take a drink and it just doesn't seem to go away and it just feels like it's stuck. That can be a sign that the muscles are having some difficulty too. Now, when it comes to swallowing, some folks had asked, well, is there anything to do to help with swallowing other than take my time, cut my food into small bites, take small sips? And there certainly is. Swallowing is a very fast, very finely tuned exercise of the body, but there are many things that can impact swallowing. So when we do a swallowing assessment, we're looking at how are the muscles moving, how's the range of motion of the muscles. We're also looking at the coordination of how the muscles are moving. Coordination is very important for swallowing. We're also looking at whether or not there's any weakness involved in the muscles. And depending on which of those areas is impacted, that's how we know, okay, this is what we think would be good to follow up on. So there are postural techniques that can be used. I think probably most people are really familiar with a chin tuck. Hands, if anybody's ever told you, oh, if you're having trouble coughing when you're eating, put your chin down. And that is a very valid postural technique that we use. However, it's not safe across the board. For some people, a chin tuck actually makes things worse. There are head turns that we can do. There are maneuvers that are involved. There's like a timing of swallowing and coughing that we can train. There are exercises to strengthen the muscles themselves, and there are dietary modifications that can be made. So there are a lot of ways to tackle swallowing difficulty. I just really encourage you, if you even have a little question of whether or not you're having some trouble, reach out to your doctor and ask to go see a speech therapist for an assessment to get yourself on your way to making meals more enjoyable and keeping yourself as healthy as possible.
That's great. Well, in the interest of time, I mean, if anybody has any last parting words, but let's thank the panelists, for a great discussion. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Day, and the rest of the panel. Next, I would like to introduce a couple occupational therapists. They're very helpful in getting us to go about our daily activities and giving us good pointers on how helpful ways we can get around. The first one is Jessica Wilczynski, as she's an occupational therapist who works with neurologic populations member of the Johns Hopkins interdisciplinary team at the Ataxia Center and educates patients and families in exercise and household modifications. And Marlene Casey, an occupational therapist and certified lymphedema therapist at Johns Hopkins Hospital. She treats both the Ataxia and oncology patients, and this is the third time Marlene has presented at the National Ataxia Conference. Please welcome Marlene and Jessica.
So my name's Marlena. I'll get us started. Jess will be joining us in just a bit. We are both occupational therapists at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and we're here today to talk to you about home safety modifications. How can you make the environment you're living in be better so you can be more successful and independent? And I don't know if I have this sensor. To switch the slide?
It should be up there. I think it's just that mouse.
Okay. Oh, here you go. I introduced us.
Hi, everybody.
Just going to move. No, it's not working. The next slide. Just a second. Technical difficulties trying to go on to the next slide.
Is it on?
Our objectives today are to understand how to adapt and modify the home environment, identify accessibility options for your current home environment, identify smart home features, so that's a phrase you may be hearing more of now, as assistive technology, and understand universal design concepts and how to access contractors to make these changes.
Okay, so some barriers are more person-specific, so kind of things that are inside you and things that you do, and then some are more environmental-specific. So more person-specific challenges could include if you're overusing your muscles, if you have back pain, if you have a hard time with balance or walking or transfers, or if you have some difficulty with dressing or needing assistance for bathing or even grocery shopping and things like that. And then more environmental challenges, or if you have a hard time with entering your home because the doorways are too narrow, if there's a really large threshold, or if the lighting is really poor. Some other areas that would be challenging, like if you can't get to certain spaces in your bedroom or your bathroom, or if countertops or cabinets are a little bit too high or out of reach or uncomfortable for you to reach. And, okay.
So why are we concerned about the home environment? The biggest thing we tend to worry about, especially with ataxia, is falls, because that is what presents a danger to us. A fall is defined as a sudden and unintentional change in position, resulting in an individual landing at a lower level. So that does not always mean you coming fully to the floor. That can mean you injuring yourself on an object, the edge of a counter. Any loss of balance is what we are worried about. Anything that sort of trips you up, let's say. What concerns us then is that this fear of falling decreases our social interactions, because if we are concerned about always falling in an environment, it makes us not want to go to that environment. So we want to show you today how to reduce this risk of falling in your home, because as you can see on this next slide, most of our falls occur within our home. So this is where we most often fall. And most of these falls are not due to what you are doing or so much yourself, but due to the environmental barriers that are impacting you with ataxia. First, we're going to address different parts of the home, and the gateway to your home, thank you, is entrance modifications. How do you get in and out? How are you accessing the community? How are you getting into your home? What we want to do is make it more accessible and make it safer to do this. Ways that we can do that are increasing lighting, making lighting with sensors, so those can be based on the time of day. If you know it gets dark at 6 o'clock, having the lights come on a little bit before, or motion-activated sensors for lights. So when it senses you coming and going, it's lighting up the entranceway. Installing stair rails on both sides. It's important to have that bilateral versus one-sided, what we call unilateral, support, because if you do go to fall, you have something that you can access on both sides to regain your balance. Lever versus knob-style door handles. A knob requires the use of our full hand versus a lever. If we have decreased grasp, which can happen with ataxia, we can use our wrist or versus like our thumb to turn the door handle. A use of a beveled, no-trip threshold. I'll show you a picture of that in the next slide so I can explain a little bit better. Removing a screen or a storm door. This is important because while those things are nice sometimes to enjoy a breeze without flies, they're an additional barrier that prevents us or can make it difficult from getting into and out of the home. increasing the width of your doorways to 36 inches or greater. This allows us to use things like rollators and wheelchairs to get into and out of our home without having to constantly bump into something. And then installing a ramp, which Jessica will talk about. I'm going to show you some pictures here about the entrance modifications. And excuse us, we are shuffling papers because sometimes the screen can be a little bit difficult to see. That's why you see us up here doing that. The first picture to the left is the entrance with wide steps that you can place your whole foot on. Some older homes have very narrow steps that can make it difficult for us to have a nice landing on the step. You see the handrails on both sides so we can have a nice firm grasp. The middle picture at the bottom is what is called an easy access threshold. These are available online for around $30, and they're a brand that has been tried and true that you can place in front of a doorway if you have a home that isn't modified to make it easier so you don't have a step up in. An average threshold into a home is between 1 inch and 1.5 inches, so this takes away that step and allows you to glide into the home easier. And the picture on the right is a home that has been built with a beveled threshold, meaning it has a texture to it, so it's gripping either the bottom of your shoe, your rollator walker, or your wheelchair walker better, making it easier to get into the home.
Okay, so talking a little bit more at lighting, if you look at the picture up there, one is looking at the same staircase, one with lighting with predominantly more at the bottom of the steps, whereas then in the second lighting, they installed some lighting at the top of the steps using LED bulbs that are a little bit more high wattage but energy efficient at the same time. And the picture that might be a little bit blurry to you is looking at ramps. So if some of you have ramps, you've probably gotten them installed. I would recommend getting an ADA certified contractor to install the ramp because they'll be very strict with sticking with the guidelines. So just some simple guidelines to adhere to. When you have a ramp, you should have 2 level surfaces on both sides with a certain slope and a certain pitch. You should be using the least possible slope that you can, and the ratio that they'll recommend is about 1 to 12, depending on what unit of measure that you're working with. The landing should be about 60 inches on both sides to give you enough room if you need to turn around or then back up to step into or out of a doorway.
So now that we've addressed getting into and out of the home, what can we do inside the home to make moving around easier? I'm going to start with some general interior modifications. The first one that I like is installing swing clear hinges on doorways. I'll show you a picture of that to show you what I mean, so you can go to your local store and purchase it. However, what they do is widen the doorway so you can make full use of the door, so that the door can open to its fullest extent. Installing door lever handles again, so the same thing on the inside versus the knobs. Creating clear pathways in between rooms and checking carpeting to make sure that all the carpet is level in between rooms or the surfaces are level. And if they are not, and it's a throw rug, taping down that throw rug to ensure safety. And installing a stair glide or elevator or a hydraulic lift. The hydraulic lifts tend to be more affordable, and they're something that you can put your assistive device on versus an elevator, which would obviously be an expensive addition to the home. I want to give a quote here that sort of exemplifies the importance of making these modifications and how it can really assist somebody's life. After the adaptation, our son would not have to be waiting for us all the time, and we did not have to follow him all the time. He took the elevator, went up and down, played outside. It really gave him back the independence he had lost and reduced the burden of care for caregivers and increased his self-esteem. This shows that by making simple modifications to the home, it can really make a difference and allow us to have more independence. These are the pictures of the swing clear hinges. As you can see, normally when we open a door, there's that little bit of space which results in about 2 to 3 inches of space lost, where the door comes and hits the door frame. The swing clear hinge allows it to extend the door, resulting in a wider opening. And sometimes if we're using a rollator or a wheelchair, it's that 2 to 3 inches that we need to get through the door successfully. Again, not using the knob, but using the lever, and there's the stair glide going up and down. So for stairways that have a turn or something else, it would require a little bit more modification or contract service. But if you have an up and down or straight vertical stair glide, that makes it a little bit easier.
Okay, so some more interior modifications. Instead of just one switch to enter and exit a room or going up and down the stairs, you can actually have a switch at the top and the bottom that controls the same light fixture. So that way, if you have a really big room or when you're going up and down stairs, you are not doing anything in the dark, and you don't have to make excessive movements to turn the light on and off. Having handrails on both sides, we've seen some pictures of them. I'm going to show you some more. And for steps, if you have non-carpeted steps, having a non-slip surface on them, or if you do have carpet, making sure it's not busy, that the carpeting is low pile, and that there's thin padding underneath, so you're not going to be catching your foot when you're going up and down. And having some automatic night lights. I'm going to show you 2 different examples on the next slide, but they can really help when you're getting up in the middle of the night, because I know I, for one, have to get about 3 times to go to the bathroom, and it's not really great to do that if you're in the dark. All right, so some examples, some bilateral handrails, and with the modern advances that are coming up, they look really nice sometimes, inside and outside of the home. The second picture on the top is looking at the contrast treads on stairs. So if you have a hard time when you're at the top of steps, seeing the difference between one step and the one below it, you can use contrasting electrical tape to put at the edge of the step, so you know exactly where your foot needs to go and you're not going to slide right off. The third picture is looking at non-slip stair treads, and those are reasonably affordable, somewhere between like $20 to $40 depending on the brand that you can put on the step, and that just, if you have a tendency to slip, this just takes away that and increases your safety a little bit. And on the bottom, these are 2 different styles of automatic night lights. The one on the left is the standard nightlight that usually comes on when the room gets a little bit darker. If you put them low near the ground, you'll be able to see where your foot is being placed as you're walking around. And the one on the right is motion centered. So they're a little bit more expensive, but it will go on when it sees that you're coming, and it'll go off when there's no movement around.
So the next room we're going to talk about is the kitchen. Kitchens tend to be the gathering place for us and our families, and it has a large, again, social component. So adapting that so that it works for everybody. The best adaptations are making it easier for you so you can conserve energy and do the things you want to do in the kitchen versus making it feel like a chore. Some ways to make things easier are to move most commonly used items to the bottom shelf of the higher cabinets and the top shelf of the lower cabinets. That way you're not always reaching up and down to an extreme or risk a fall. Also installing the use of lazy Susans. You can have a lot of items accessible. That way you can turn versus having to reach into 10 different cabinets to get items that are similar. A refrigerator, there's a couple different styles, and Jess will go over them, but placing items most commonly used at the front of the refrigerator. So for instance, if you know you have fried eggs every morning, placing eggs, milk, if you keep your coffee in the fridge, all those things right at the front and at a height you can reach so that you're not constantly reaching in the back or having to rearrange in a tight refrigerator. Having a working space in the kitchen so that if you need to pace activities and sit down to do them, that your working space is convenient to items you are using, and that you have stable seating or a stable standing area if you're using a rollator. In the kitchen, OTs, we love adaptive equipment and we love to change things, and there's a ton of adaptive equipment for the kitchen. Weighted silverware is a good way to address a tremor because it allows you to tell your body where it is in space. The weight provides proprioceptive feedback, so your body doesn't have to work so hard to stabilize the hand you're using to eat with. A reacher to grab maybe things that are harder out of place or the things you didn't move to the front of the cabinets. Weighted cutting board, that way you're not at risk with a thin cutting board moving, but it has some weight to it. And if you look on Amazon or Google, they have some really neat ones now. Some have a stabilizing stick on them where you can stick an apple to cut. So if you have one hand that tends to be more stable than the other, you can use that hand to cut. A rocker knife, that's a knife that's shaped like a U, where you can use a whole hand grasp to cut an item versus having to use a fine-tuned grasp with a regular knife. We want good lighting in these areas. You'll hear us say that over and over because good lighting makes it easier to see. And then making sure that you have roll-under spaces. So oftentimes people will leave a roll-under space underneath their sink because if we're doing dishes a large portion of the day, it makes it easier to sit while doing these tasks versus to stand. Speaking of water, another important thing is the water temperature. I don't know about you, but I have no idea what my water heater is set at. However, it's supposed to be set at 120 degrees or less, so checking those things for safety is also good. Next, we're going to address the bathroom. Overall, bathrooms should have comfortable height toilets, non-slip floors, both in the tub and the shower as well, and low or no threshold entrances to your shower. So there are two kinds of showers, a walk-in shower, which is what is more accessible, but they still tend to have an inch or so threshold, and then a tub shower, one you have to lift your leg into. Installing grab bars at the toilet, sink, and shower is good because if you do lose your balance, because we're working with slippery surfaces in the bathroom, you have something to stabilize yourself with. Lever-style faucets for the sink, an adjustable handheld shower head. This way, if you were using a tub transfer bench or a shower chair, you are not sitting with direct water pressure on you. You can control where the water goes. Non-slip tape that you can place on the tub. This is typically sold at Walmart or you can get it online. These are strips that you can place in the tub yourself if you know you're standing in a certain area. Rounding corners to promote safety. So picking a sink style, oftentimes they have those hard, sharp corners, placing foam padding on them, which you can buy at your local hardware store, or ensuring that you have rounded corners, because when we fall, those will be the first things to hurt us. Creating sitting clearance at your vanity by removing the vanity door and shelves, and then increasing the height of the toilet by either purchasing a comfort height toilet. Most toilets are 17 inches, and those are too low typically for having trouble sitting down and getting up. Or you can add a seat riser, a component that you put on the seat of your toilet to make it a little bit higher. And a lot of those come with grab bars, so it can help you get up as well. This is a picture of the lever handles. So there's the ones that go up, there's the ones that go to the side, and now a lot of sinks are even getting sensor, so you can just place your hand in front of them. Those are the non-skid treads I had been mentioning earlier for the tub, and these tend to be aesthetically pleasing if you don't want the big bubble kind we're so used to, which is on the next slide here. Now, while those tend to stick and be removable, so if you're renting, for example, or don't want to place something on the bottom of your tub, it would be the blue one you would use here. The tub transfer bench, typically as occupational therapists, we think about those for persons who are using a wheelchair. However, if you have trouble at all clearing your foot over the tub edge or are worried about it, it would be smarter to purchase the tub transfer bench because you could transition to it if needed. And the picture on the top right is the shower chair. Notice the shower chair, you can adjust the height. It has a suction cup bottom, the back, and the handles are removable. So even with the adaptive equipment itself, it can be modified. The picture at the top left is the handheld shower head. There's the toilet safety frame, so that's a frame around your toilet if you, for instance, already have a comfort height toilet. The seat riser is the next picture to it. A grab bar next to your toilet, and then also grab bars in and around the shower. What's important about grab bars is you can't just place them anywhere. There are ADA-specific heights, and those can be located at ada.org, where you can look up what height is appropriate to place grab bars at and what style is appropriate.
Okay, so I'm not sure if any of you guys have been familiar with the concept of universal design, but we're going to talk a little bit about that and the main areas that you are going to use, that universal design principles tend to apply a little bit more to the bathroom and the kitchen. I really like this quote that universal design, it should be not stigmatizing or disadvantage any group of people or certain individuals, and it should provide equal means of use for all possible users, and that can go throughout your house. Design should be equal, flexible, simple, and intuitive to use. It should require low physical effort and provide adequate space for everybody of all ages, children, adults, Doesn't matter what kind of adaptive equipment, assisted device, if you're in a wheelchair, if you're walking and ambulatory, that you're able to use it without exerting too much energy and being able to reach and manipulate all uses. So I know a lot of you, I see a decent amount of you guys in wheelchairs. How does it feel when you're trying to wash dishes at the sink and you're kind of in this awkward position? Universal Design is really trying to make it so you're able to do them in a good position with good body mechanics and limit extra joint strain or pain. So this slide is showing an example of a Universal Design kitchen. If you can see, this is just one example. There's a lot of different ways to do this. It is typically stylish and livable for everyone. It doesn't look really different. There's no huge modifications to it that you can see, but there's a lot that are kind of embedded in the actual framework of it. The gentleman in the wheelchair is rolling underneath the stovetop. So there are doors on his. Sometimes this is open space. Sometimes there are cabinets, so it looks like it's a fake cabinet. The outlets are raised, so nobody has to be reaching all the way down to the ground in order to plug anything in. The doorways are wider, at least 36 inches, in order to allow for a wheelchair to go in and out. There's a raised dishwasher. There are varying heights of countertops. Another thing that you don't see in this one, but there's typically a pot filler that's either over the stovetop or next to it, so you don't have to put your pot of water in the sink and then drag it all the way over to the stove to get it on there. There's actually a water faucet that's next to the stove. Some other things to consider are different heights countertops, so you don't have to be straining, raising your arm up really high in order to be doing something in a seated position. Here are some examples over here. Starting with the refrigerators, the two best commonly accessible refrigerators that are still stylish, there's no true modifications to them, is either the freezer-fridge side-by-side combination, and in here, like Marlena talked about with organizing your space, putting commonly used items within reach, and you can do that for both freezer and fridge. And the French door style, where the fridge is on top and the freezer is below, you can have easy access to both. The freezer is a pull-out where the door is open side-by-side. And that is an example of the pot filler on the right. So that actually extends over top. If you put your pot over there, when you're done with boiling water, you can drag it over the countertop if able, or have someone else come pick it up for you. But generally we say put a pot holder on the countertop, put the pot on the pot holder, and then you can just slide it across the countertop rather than having to put something in your lap or try to carry it. A couple more different universal design features are having a lower microwave height. If you can see the one in the bottom. And the two pictures on the left, I'm having some visual spatial issues with looking at this, are Lazy Susans. So there's two different styles. The bottom picture is where they just spin in the cabinet, and the other one is where they spin and actually pull out, so you have a little bit more access to reach for them. The top picture is an example of a pull-out cutting board. Also pull out recycling bins, and then that way if you pull out the cutting board, you can roll right up to it or stand next to the countertop with a hand on the counter, and you can be chopping from there. When you're done with it, wipe it off, push it back in. Some other areas where we can apply universal design principles are in the bathroom. So looking at this picture, this is one example. The mirror is tilted, so if you are in a sitting position, you still have full view of your face. The sink is attached to the wall, so you're able to roll underneath it. Looking at the shower, there is no threshold. The bottom of the shower floor is a little bit pitched, so water is not going to be spraying out. There's a handheld shower head that you can take off the wall and put it back on the holder if needed. There are two grab bars in there. I think something that is not pictured because of the angle is there's a bench that's folded up into the wall, but you can pull it down and sit on that. There's in-shower lighting that increases your visibility in the shower. There's no dark spots. And there's non-skid flooring on the bottom. For universal designs, bathrooms should have comfort height toilets, non-slip floors inside the shower or the tub, and also outside the shower and the tub. Lower no-threshold showers with seats, and plenty of task lighting for whichever area you're choosing to do the activity in. So here, this is animated and half of the room is gone. But I thought that this was a really good description of just looking what a standard bathroom looks like and then how it can be changed and modified after universal design. So the before picture has a tub in it, has low lighting, the vanity is closed, the toilet is a regular style. After, you can see that they have removed the tub. They have added a support wall that they can then put on grab bars, and it actually helps to attach the seat. That's the fold-down seat inside the shower. There is a handheld shower head, and all of the controls are at waist height, so everyone can control them. Nothing's out of reach. The toilet is an adjustable height toilet. The vanity you can roll under, and they replace all of the lighting with LED bulbs that are efficient and a higher wattage. You can also install higher wattage lights with a dimmer switch, so if you don't really like the high light all the time, you can then dim the light down to whatever is appropriate for you.
The term smart home is something that we're hearing more in the media nowadays, and it's becoming more accessible. Before, it was associated with Bill Gates and millions of dollars, but now a lot of these things are very accessible and affordable. The term smart home refers to a residence equipped with technology that facilitates monitoring of residents and/or promotes independence and increases residents' quality of life. Smart home can be categorized a couple different ways. The first way is hubs and controllers. So Amazon Echo Dots, Google Home, all of the things that can control multiple devices. And we're going to go into some of these things to give you a better idea of what we mean. There are smart locks. Again, we'll have an example of this with a video. Smart doorbells, thermostats, if you're familiar with Nest, home security systems, and then door openers. The first one we're going to go over is a hub and controller called Alexa. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. And we're going to have a video to describe it a little bit more. Hopefully there is sound.
Talk a little bit about Alexa.
So in the meantime, I'll talk a little bit about Alexa. What it does is it's a voice-activated system in which you can hook up lights or other devices to it so that they are totally voice-controlled. So for example, instead of having to go turn on the light, you would say, Alexa, turn on light. It goes so far and so advanced as to even turn on different colored lights, all those kind of things. You can also ask it questions, so it acts in a technology way like that, which is more so how it's promoted on the TV, but it can really increase safety because, for instance, if you were going down the stairs and you want to go to a well-lit area, telling Alexa to turn on the lights for you would make it much safer. And then the next device is a Nest. It's a smart home featured thermostat. It learns your preferences so that you are not always having to adjust the thermostat yourself. It's a turnstile device, so instead of using a finger to control a button, which can be harder if we have a tremor, you can use your whole hand. And then it also helps to save energy, which is more so how Nest promotes it.
This thermostat will make you love your thermostat. It's in millions of homes around the world. It's saved billions of kilowatt hours of energy so far. third generation Nest Learning thermostat. It has a bigger, sharper screen, and it's even better at learning what you like. Just turn it up or down. It will catch on after a few days and create a personalized schedule for you. That's how the Nest thermostat saves energy.
And I'll have them pause it right there.
Real family.
So another thing about the Nest thermostat, there's no true button that you have to hit with a finger, which sometimes I know incoordination is a big characteristic of ataxia. So using your whole hand or just like a palm to be able to turn it up or down is a little bit more helpful and less frustrating than trying to hit a button to make a temperature go up or down. The next one we're going to do is looking at Lutron Cassetta, which is talking a little bit more about lighting. This can also be paired and synced with Alexa or some other of the smart home devices.
Hey, I'm here in the CNET Smart Home to show you what I think is some of the best connected home tech that money can currently buy. It's the Lutron Cassetta in-wall dimming switch. Over the course of a couple months of testing here at the Smart Home, the Lutron switches have been exceptional. They work with everything we've tested them with. They've always been reliable, like Mom was one of them. Integrations have all worked. Voice commands, they're just very, very smooth, reliable, nice smart phones. Now, unlike some other smart switches, the Lutron Cassetta switches don't use Wi-Fi radios. Instead, they communicate using the Lutron Connect signal, proprietary language that they use. For that reason, you'll need to have the Lutron grid plugged into your router to act as translator, but it's easy to set up and everything works really well. Aside from turning things on and off with the switch, you can use the Siri voice command, but these are Apple Home lights. You can say, Siri, turn the kitchen lights off, or turn the pantry light off here. You can say, turn all the downstairs lights off. All of that will work if you program it in the app. Lutron switches work with Alexa, too, so if you enable that skill, you can tell Alexa to turn the lights on and off in just the same way. Other useful integrations include Wink and If, and also the Nest Learning thermostat, which you can control right from the Lutron app. The same is true for popular smart thermostats from Honeywell and Ecobee. Compatibility is a huge strong point. All in all, Lutron in-wall dimming switches really check off all the boxes that I look for in a good smart lighting product. They work reliably well, they work with a wide variety of different products and services, and they have a very good set of features available right out of the box. The two-switch starter kit.
Okay, and we can stop it there. Thank you. And the last one that we're going to just provide a little demonstration is a smart lock system that can then also be paired with Alexa, Google Home, things like that, and also can be controlled by your cell phone. And we'll stop there. Thank you. So a good feature for this is if you are having someone come into your home on a regular basis to help you with caregiving skills, or if you have a friend coming over, you don't have to take the 15, 20-yard step to the door to unlock the door. You can save some energy, use this device, and stay in the position you are in, and then enjoy the company that you have when they get in there.
So we've given you a lot of resources today, but often taking the first step is the hardest. So we always want to provide you with community resources to help you get started. Two of the ones that I'd like to highlight are the National Association of Home Builders Certified Aging in Place. They're called CAP specialists. These are specialists in universal design. You want to hire a contractor or make sure you're hiring a contractor who knows what they're doing and is aware of universal design and mobility. So these are people that would help you do that. Also, the National Council on Independent Living Centers. These are centers typically within your county that provide information and referrals on how to get funding to help with some of these modifications in your area.
And these are some links. These slides will be available online afterwards. So these are some links to just help with connecting you with contractors if you are interested in some home modifications or designs. ADA directory, that is a national, so it's nationwide, and you can look in specific regions. The Universal Design Specific, that is a great resource that has different contractors, and they can put you in touch with potentially local contractors to help you. And again, the National Association of Home Builders, they can find certified aging and space specialists, which can be therapists, can be contractors, or other health professionals. And I did want to talk about a little bit the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. So that is specific to this area, if anyone is local. But if you go on and look for ADA centers for your region, they can put you in touch with a resource officer that can help you with home modifications, but also if you're trying to get like a modified van, or even if you need employment modifications in your workspace. They're a great resource to know about and have. If you did want to have an OT or a PT come into your house, they can come in, do a functional assessment, survey your home for hazards, and they can observe you doing specific activities that are difficult or challenging for you, from bathing and getting dressed all the way to cooking, going out in the community to grocery shopping. And they can recommend specific home modifications, assistive technology, or the way that you go about performing the task. That's what we call activity modifications.
There are financial resources if you choose to do some of these modifications yourself. The first is an access loan, and that's a loan for making home modifications at a low interest rate. The second part is a lot of these modifications, like ramps, modifying electrical outlets and fixtures, modifying kitchen cabinets, basically a lot of the things we've talked about today, you can claim as an IRS deduction. The next slide is a quote, and it's a quote I like to end with because it sums up what we talked about today. Look at the opportunity of design to empower everyone. And I think the key part there is everybody.
So we're not going to have time right now for questions, but we are available and we'll be kind of walking around. There is a slide that has our contact information on it, and we'll leave that up there for a minute or two. Oh. Or not. Okay, so those are both of our email addresses with our names. We both work at Johns Hopkins, so even if you go up to the booth, and our cards are out there if you wanted to get that as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jessica and Marlene. A few last things I'm going to say. One of the things you've heard over and over and over from most of our speakers has been exercise. Exercise is very helpful and it's helped me keep going. And one of the things I do is I write a recumbent trach. And I visited, like I said, with Jenny Keller and Dr. Amy Bastian now at the Kennedy Krieger Institute. And one day, Amy Bastian looked at me and she says, "Mike, you're a very unfair patient to me." And I'm like, "Why is that?" And she's like, "You keep your health. You maintain your fitness and make my job harder because I got to make tasks more difficult for you." Another thing, young investigators and your own physicians even. I know my personal physician at home, he's been very interested in learning about ataxia. And a term that I use a lot is all experts were once beginners. So all young investigators coming up and learning from the senior investigators, they will one day be experts. They might not exactly get it right now, but as they learn, they will become the experts in the field. Get involved in a support group. Go out and meet people in your area. If there is no support group, start one. Even a casual group of getting together with other people with ataxia at the coffee shop or a library, someplace to meet together, and start to build a support network amongst yourselves. Fundraise. Do anything you can to fundraise. My mother-in-law helped us in Mescal last year by just doing a Christmas bazaar at our church and raised almost $1,000 for the NAF with just that little function. And it doesn't take a lot. CORDS, it was mentioned earlier, but CORDS lets pharma researchers and investigators know we're out there. If we don't sign up for it, they don't think we exist, and they're not going to look at researching ataxia. So make sure you sign up with CORDS and stay involved with that.